Good evening, one and all. And today we are going to discuss another one of Capturing Christianity's demonic videos. And I don't mean that just in terms of how, terrible they are. I mean, in terms of this one's actually about demons. He's got quite a few of these, and he really seems to be cashing in the last few months with yet more of these demon videos because they're one of the few types of videos of his that get a lot of viewers. This one I listened to part of a couple of months back, and I meant to do a response, and so here it is. This gentleman here whom Cameron is interviewing is a psychiatrist who somehow, well, he sort of explains it here, but he somehow got into the business of consulting for exorcists in giving them some kind of medical advice about whether their conditions were due to a real demon possession or not. And so we'll see what Cameron has to say about that here. So let's jump straight in and have a look at the video.
All right, let's turn back to your story and the topic for today. So the question that I'd like to ask you at the outset before we get into your experiences is, would you describe yourself more as someone who is naturally skeptical or someone who is naturally sort of credulous?
No, I'm actually quite a skeptical person, which of course surprises people when they hear that I probably diagnosed, investigated more of these cases of possession than any other doctor in the world. That's why I'm scientific advisor to the International Association of Exorcists, which is approved by the Vatican. So I'm not an exorcist, but I've seen a tremendous amount of these cases. My old
I'm not an exorcist, but I do play one on TV.
academic chairman, who was a Catholic himself, he said I probably have seen more. Because of Zoom, because of telephone, that sort of thing, I've probably seen more of these cases than any physician in history. In terms of going into an individual case, certainly at the beginning, especially until I got a little more experience in the field, which I got fairly rapidly after this priest came to my office at Cornell. I was skeptical. Now, I was brought up like most Christians on the Gospels, and I certainly thought that possession probably existed as a phenomenon in history. But I thought it was so rare, and it is relatively rare if we're talking about possession, that I would never see a case. So when the priest asked me to evaluate a case, which turned out to be what we call an oppression, not a possession, but it was a genuine demonic attack. When I told the priest, who was sort of this academic-looking guy, a little bit rumpled, but certainly one of the few but most prominent exorcists in the United States at the time. I call him Father Jacques. I use pseudonyms throughout the book, but all the details are accurate. A lot of people know who this guy was, but I still use a pseudonym, Father Jacques. And I said to Father Jacques, well, Father.
Yeah, so this guy does remind me a bit of Grandpa Simpson. He does tend to ramble a little bit. I mean, I guess, when you reach his level of experience with demons, you can maybe be forgiven a little bit of rambling. Back in the day, we wore onions on our belts, which was the custom at the time. Anyway, yes, so I think it's amusing here, first of all, that we get the classic avowal of prior skepticism, which is a motif that I discuss in my book, which you almost always hear or very often hear when people are about to introduce some kind of miraculous or supernatural or paranormal claim. They'll say that initially they were skeptical about it. This is a way of trying to increase the believability of what nonsense they're about to spread. The other thing is he almost immediately contradicts himself by saying, well, he was skeptical. I mean, although he was raised as a Christian and did believe in demon possessions, but he just didn't think they were very common, even though he also thinks that that's true. They aren't very common, but they do exist. So it doesn't really sound like he was skeptical at all, because he says that he used to believe that demon possessions occurred but were rare. And he now also believes that demon possessions occur and they're rare. So I don't really know where the skepticism came into it, because it seems like he didn't even change his mind about anything, at least nothing substantive there. So I think that this should all be seen as hot air. But it's sort of interesting to see how the skepticism is used in almost a positive sense here. Often it's kind of, well, ironically, demonized in Christian discourse, especially like apologetic discourse, the diehard skeptic, or having skeptical doubts, or being too skeptical, doubting Thomas kind of thing. Here it seems like it's being presented as a positive, at least initially, even though it doesn't actually appear that there's any substance to this skepticism. Whenever anyone claims that they were skeptical, you should ask how their skepticism was manifested. So what critical questions do they ask? What alternative explanations did they pursue? What research or opposing views did they consult? How did they try to prove themselves wrong, et cetera, et cetera? These are the ways that one manifests genuine skepticism. If people claim to have been skeptical or to currently be skeptical, but aren't able to provide any examples of skeptical behavior, then you should just ignore that as just bluster. All right, let's continue.
With all due respect, I'm a standard trained psychiatrist, and I'm a little skeptical of that stuff. And he said to me with a smirk, he said, "Well, then, Dr. Gallagher, you're the perfect man for the job," because they wanted someone skeptical. And probably, Cameron, people should go into each case with a little bit of skepticism. I'm certainly not an overly credulous person. It takes real evidence. This is not something I intuit, and it's not something by and large that the Catholic Church intuits. You have to have very hard evidence that something like this exists.
Yeah. Yes, and we'll see in due course what that hard evidence looks like, or what he means by hard evidence or real evidence.
That's a big part of what I try to do to help out the exorcist.
So yeah, this would be a good segue into what was your introduction like into the world of demonic possession, exorcisms, and the like?
So this priest who I call Father Jacques, again, I'm a doctor, so everything is confidential in terms of names. Although, for instance, you mentioned the book; everything is completely accurate in the book. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered writing.
Which
it.
was the custom at the time.
He sent me a case. It was actually from a couple of thousand miles away, and she came to my office with her husband, and they both claimed that she was getting beaten up by invisible spirits. And I want to make sure she didn't have, some odd kind of neurological disorder, or that she didn't have a clotting disorder. So we sent her to a hematologist. We checked her platelets, and everything seemed to be pretty normal. And when I did a normal psychiatric evaluation, she seemed to be a psychologically healthy, in fact, wonderful type of person.
Okay, so this is very interesting, right? So he mentions checking platelets because blood clotting disorders can be one cause of unexplained bruising, and checking platelets is a way to determine whether that might be a cause. And then he does psychological or psychiatric evaluation as well. But notice there that the first thing that he suggests, and he talks about this in other cases as well, is to attempt to find an organic cause, or a medical cause, or a psychological cause of the claimed symptoms, right? One question we should ask at this point is why? I mean, they are claiming that the woman is demonically possessed. Why not just believe them, right? I mean, shouldn't we believe people's testimony unless we have reason not to? I mean, that's a claim that many apologists make. But the point is, why do we need to exclude these other causes? And the reason is, of course, because demonic possession or oppression, or whatever that distinction is, we'll hear more about that later. It's entirely a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that in order to be diagnosed, or I don't know what word they use exactly, pronounced as oppressed or possessed, you have to exclude these other potential causes, at least to the satisfaction of whatever medical doctors they get, like this guy, to declare that. And this means that there's no positive way to assess whether someone is actually demonically possessed or oppressed. All you can do is rule out other causes of their symptoms, and then on that basis declare, well, I guess they're possessed because we sort of can't figure out any other explanation. Diagnoses of exclusion do exist in medicine, but they are highly problematic for this reason, that you can never have any kind of direct or positive evidence in favor of them. You only sort of reach them by excluding other things. And for that reason, they're regarded with some skepticism and regarded as kind of problematic. That there really should be a revision of the diagnostic criteria as we better understand the disease or the condition, so that we can actually determine something that's sort of positive evidence in favor of it, rather than just excluding other diagnoses. But the point is that demonic possession will never reach that, and to my knowledge, no one's even trying to do that, because there are no diagnostic criteria or medical facts or anything about possession, because the whole thing is made up and it's entirely ad hoc. And we'll see that going through this interview, just as we've seen with previous ones. There are no clear criteria or clear standards about what counts as evidence in favor of a demonic possession. All that it amounts to is weird stuff going on that can't be explained by, or at least they claim, can't be explained by other medical causes. And therefore, it's entirely a diagnosis of exclusion. That in itself is extremely problematic. Whenever you have a phenomenon that can only be identified by excluding other causes, that's a red flag. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not real, but it is absolutely a red flag, because basically you can never be sure that you've excluded all other possible causes, right? You can only exclude the things that you know how to exclude. So there's always an element of doubt, and maybe a very large element of doubt, that you've successfully excluded all other possibilities. So we'll see that going through. But I just think it's interesting that is core to the whole methodology that's used here, and they don't even seem to realize how problematic that is fundamentally as a methodological limitation.
Who nevertheless was reporting that constantly she'd be like in her house, and she would be literally experience a feeling of being beaten up by invisible forces. I mean, even when other people are around, they could see it happening. They could see the bruises appear, even though they could do nothing about it. And I wound up liking the woman a lot and evaluating her. Again, this is not a woman who was some kind of evil woman or something. And I said to the priest, well, look, Father, I kind of agree with you that this goes beyond just a medical or a psychiatric condition. And he said to me, yes, Dr. Gallagher, that's what I thought. I wanted to make sure, but this is what we call an oppression, which gets into the whole difference of categories between oppressions and possessions, that sort of thing, which I eventually became very well versed in. Soon after that, I saw a number of actual cases that are even more dramatic, where the individual is actually possessed. I do want to emphasize that oppressions are more common. They're not common, but they are more common, much more common than possessions, which are fairly rare.
Before we get into to other,
Yes, just like pink fairies are much rarer than blue fairies. So blue fairies aren't common, but they are more common than pink fairies, which are extremely rare indeed.
cases that, as you say, are more dramatic. With respect to this case, is it possible that she could have been experiencing some sort of psychosis? Is there some kind of medical condition that can explain the appearance of bruises or the sort of sense or feeling of bruises happening on the body? Is there any kind of like medical condition that could explain that?
Okay, so this is a good question, right? But I think that we should take a step back from that and wonder or think, why would Cameron ask this, or why would any Christian ask this? If you believe in possession or oppression or whatever else, then if what's happening seems to match, the criteria for a possession, and the people in question believe that that's what's happening, then why not just think, oh yeah, that's the best explanation, right? And what I'm getting at here is that there seems to be an acknowledgement that if any better explanation is available, really any possible medical or psychiatric explanation or psychological explanation is available, then that is actually better than demons. So there's an acknowledgement here that demons is a bad explanation, maybe a tacit acknowledgement at least. But nevertheless, because otherwise, what sort of, it's unclear why you would ask this. Like, oh, we have an explanation for this. It's demonic possession. Kind of, what's the problem, right? Back in the 17th century, at least in some circles, this would have been readily accepted as like, oh yeah, demon possession. What's the issue? Particularly before we had an understanding of mental disorders and such. By even asking this question, I think that there's an acknowledgement that a demonic possession is a bad explanation, and we should only appeal to that if if truly we have no other idea. Now, of course, that doesn't follow, because even if there were no available explanations, it doesn't mean that we should accept a demon possession as the explanation. Maybe we should just say, we're not sure, we don't know yet, we haven't worked it out. There's a lot that we still don't understand about the human mind. Now, the appearance of inexplicable bruising, I don't actually think is that is that inexplicable. I think that from what I've gathered, there are quite a lot of conditions that can explain this, blood clotting disorders just being one of those. Self-harm would be another obvious example, by the way, and he mentioned that he doesn't think she was psychotic, but that's a bit different from self-harm. But anyway, I mean, there's not enough details to say in this case, but the point is that that's not really anything that is that unusual or amazing. It's not like they're levitating in front of 5 witnesses or something and it was caught on camera. It's just bruising that is a bit hard to explain. There could be all number of conditions that could potentially cause that, right? Relating to the skin or to the blood or to psychiatric disorders or to self-harm or whatever else. And Cameron seems to almost acknowledge that, right? When he says, well, but is there any medical explanation? As if, well, we're only, even the Christian who believes in this will only resort to this demonic explanation if nothing else is available. And I think that basically that's an admission of defeat. Even asking this is an admission that, yeah, actually this is a bad explanation. So in a sense, this illustrates the fundamental weakness of the approach, that it's only ever appealed to when nothing else is at least readily available to explain the condition. But so all you have to do is point out, well, there's a lot that we still don't understand, or that maybe we didn't, what wasn't investigated in this particular case. So, I mean, if you're willing to ask the question, is there any possible medical cause? Why not be just slightly more, I guess, open-minded about the idea that perhaps there was a medical cause that we just didn't, or psychiatric cause that we just weren't able to uncover in this particular case. And then you don't have any need to appeal to demons, right? So I think there's almost an admission by asking that question that the whole demon thing is kind of silly in the first place. Like, well, why would you appeal to that as an explanation? Because if it was a good explanation, why wouldn't you just go straight there? Why would you always have to worry about there being a medical explanation first?
Well, there are some of these esoteric conditions. I mean, there's something called psychogenic purpura, which is also a very rare condition where bruises can appear to happen out of the blue. Obviously, in psychiatry, I mean, you always have to rule out that somebody's not beating this person up, like there is a domestic abuse or something. But it became very clear to me that all the medical tests were negative, and that her story, which was verified by other people, by the way, not just by herself, was so credible and inexplicable, other than as an attack by evil spirits. I mean, she basically gave a very consistent, credible story, and that is that she would be.
Okay, so here's another question. Let's suppose that there is no medical explanation for these sudden bruises. Okay, what's the demonic explanation for it? Okay, so this woman is possessed by a demon. How does that lead to bruises? Like, where does the bruises come in? Is that a known feature of demonic possessions? I thought like levitation, or I don't know, manic laughing, or speaking in languages that the person didn't know, or having knowledge of things that they shouldn't know about, or engaging in immoral behaviors. I thought these were more symptoms of demonic possessions, because Cameron heard, we talked about these in a previous video that Cameron's done. Now apparently bruising is one as well. I might be inclined to ask, is there any symptom that couldn't be explained by demonic possession? Is there something that's like, no, demonic possessions never do this, right? Or never result in this type of symptom? Because, you know, if it can explain anything, then it can't really explain anything, can it? Because it just seems to be a label that applies to literally any possible symptomatology. That's just sort of useless as an explanatory postulate. If I have a toothache, is that sign of a demonic possession? No. Well, then why are bruises a sign of a demonic possession? Like, well, there seems to be no attempt to articulate why demonic possession explains inexplicable bruising. Why does it explain that more than my toothache or indigestion or, weird pain in my leg or something? Like, what's the explanatory framework here that's being used? It's rather baffling as to how, someone who's a medical doctor can just flippantly say, oh, only demonic possession can explain this, without even trying to explain why demonic possession is expected to result in this type of symptom.
Lying in bed or sitting in her house, and she would feel literally pummeled by invisible blows. Now, of course, you always have to wonder, is this woman psychotic or something like that? But nobody thought she was psychotic. I mean, I can tell when somebody as a board certified psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry now, I can tell when somebody is psychotic or not. And she had no history suggestive of psychosis.
Yeah, so that's just BS, right? So psychiatrists can, of course, diagnose people, but to do so, they need to use particular diagnostic criteria and engage in, lengthy tests and interviews and so forth, and questionnaires, and often talk to people who know them and so forth. They need to know what the normal behavior for the person is and compare that to what the change is. And even often then they get it wrong. There's a high amount of variability in assessments across medical practitioners. So for him just to say, oh, I'm an experienced psychiatrist, I know when someone's psychotic or something, that's just nonsense, right? That's just him puffing himself out there, as far as I'm concerned. That doesn't mean he doesn't have real expertise, but psychiatry just isn't that reliable. That's claims like that are just very cringe. Thanks, Jim, by the way. Good to hear that my book is getting read. I always appreciate that. All right, let's get going.
So this is the kind of role that I take on. I became fairly confident this was a psychologically healthy person. It is a judgment, but it's a judgment I was like 100% confident in. And
did you hear what he said there? Let me play that back again. Remember, this is a skeptical person who's, not inclined to be very, what was the word Cameron used? I've forgotten the word, but not inclined to believe too readily.
Kind of role that I take on. I became fairly confident this was a psychologically healthy person. It is a judgment, but it's a judgment I was like 100% confident in. And
so he formed a judgment about this patient that he was 100% confident in. 100%. So 0% possibility that he was wrong. Whenever anyone says that, I immediately dramatically downweight the credibility of anything else that they say, because it means that, it means one of two things. They're not careful in their language, in which case that's a problem here, because we're relying on him for details. And or it means that they are not good at modulating the credibility or plausibility of their own assessments, right? That you can't be 100% confident in something like that, especially in a case like this. So again, I just want to contrast that with him saying he's a skeptical person. If he was a skeptical person, he shouldn't say that he's 100% confident in any type of judgment like this. I mean, you can't really be 100% confident in any medical judgment, let alone one in a case like this that's quite unusual and involves assessment of someone's psychiatric state and so forth. That is just such a bizarre thing to say that I highlight that I don't think he's a skeptical person. He may like to think of himself as one, but he hasn't shown us any skeptical qualities so far. All he's shown is a lack of skepticism.
And it was interesting to me that the priest had already, who was an experienced exorcist and actually worked in a psychiatric hospital as a chaplain, he concurred readily that this seemed to him to be typical of an oppression, and I agree with him. Yeah, I mean, there's always a judgment, Cameron. But the judgment requires. I mean, any kind of diagnosis in medicine or psychiatry requires a clinical judgment, and this was clearly not a medical or a psychiatric disorder. This was clearly something beyond. So you have this very.
Yeah, so the thing is that at least good medical practice relies on particular diagnostic criteria, whether those are based on laboratory tests or physical symptoms or survey results or whatever it be. It's based on diagnostic criteria. And of course, the clinician will use their judgment to assess those sorts of things. But there are ideally as a scientific basis about particular criteria for diagnosing particular conditions. And those are validated against scientific evidence that establishes a link between certain symptoms or certain test results and so forth and an underlying condition. What is that scientific basis for the diagnostic criteria that are used for demonic possession? It would be interesting for him to articulate those to us so that we can understand, okay, so this is the process that one goes through. It seems that the only process is, can you think of another explanation? If not, it's probably demonic. And that is laughably stupid, would never get published in any medical journal worth its salt. Not if it's, even if you took demons out, if it was about anything else. It's like, well, can we think of something? No, it seems to us like demons. I mean, that seems to be basically the methodology here. That's just not how you engage in skeptical thinking. It's laughable as a procedure.
Sane woman who is claiming that she has a literal feeling of being beaten up by some kind of invisible spirits, let's call it. And if you think about it, what could being beaten up by invisible spirits be, other than, if words have any meaning, other than that's an evil spirit? I mean, that's not a benign spirit, that's an evil force. Now, I suppose people can say, well, this is something paranormal, we don't understand. But I think that explanation is less plausible than the one we have, which is that this is quite typical of an oppression.
That's an interesting claim. Oppression is a better explanation than some paranormal explanation we don't know about. I don't even know how to say something like that. To me, that seems to be arguing about the color of the fairies at the bottom of the garden. But anyway, yeah, I mean, what do you even say about that? Beaten up by an evil spirit or evil spirits. How does a spirit even exert a physical force on a body? I mean, I don't even want to speculate on how that is supposed to make any sense. Let's keep going.
Could it be? I just kind of want to play the role of a skeptic here. Could it have been that?
Wouldn't want to actually be skeptical, Cameron. Just play the role of a skeptic, right? What do you think of the odds that Cameron believes any of this stuff? Or is it, like, when I say this stuff, I mean specifically the demonic stuff? Or is this purely just like grift? Because, well, maybe I'll show you later. The demonic videos, like, they do really well on his channel. And that's sort of obviously why he does them, right? Because, they don't really have anything to do with defending Christianity. I strongly suspect that he doesn't really put much credence in the demonic stuff, but he just, does pretty well. So anyway, let's see what he's got to say here.
There is some maybe unknown diagnosis that is just outside of our purview at the moment in terms of like what is known within the medical community. Could it be that there is some still natural cause to what she was experiencing?
Well, again, it's a judgment call, and there's no question that it takes a certain amount of experience and judgment to be confident of something like that. For instance, in possessions, which I've seen many over the years, all of a sudden somebody may speak a foreign language. The demon may speak a foreign language, or there will be such enormous strength that I remember a woman who was possessed, who was about 90 pounds soaking wet, and she took her 200-pound Lutheran deacon and literally threw him across the room when she came into her possessed state. I've also talked, although I've never seen, I've talked over the years to about 35 different people who have reported, including 8 people who told me that a Satanist woman who was possessed, that I write about prominently in the book, that she levitated during the...
Okay, so Cameron asked, well, maybe this woman who had inexplicable bruising had a different medical condition that we just don't understand. In response to that, we're being told, well, there are other cases where people spoke foreign languages, had abnormal strength, and could cause levitation. Now, okay, well, those are much more remarkable, if they were true, than someone having inexplicable bruising. Much harder to explain, using just appealing to an unknown medical cause. The thing is, what does that have to do with this case? Cameron was asking about this case of the bruising, and in order to answer that, he's now just talking about these different cases that had different symptoms. So there's two issues here. One is, what are the symptomologies associated with demonic possession? We've got 4 different ones. It's like there's a different one each case that we get. It's kind of embarrassing, right? How do you narrow down which symptoms are specifically due to demons and which might be due to something else? But so that's one issue. But the other problem is that, well, what does appealing to these other cases have to do with anything? We're talking about this case. So can you explain how in this particular case you came to this judgment? Tell it that it was demonic possession and not some unknown cause. Telling us that there are cases that involve supposed levitation doesn't answer that, because there wasn't levitation at this case. So what are you even talking about? I don't think he draws it back. Does he draw this back?
Exorcisms. She had all kinds of psychic powers, which we can get into if you want outside of it. Now, again, you can have people who say, well, there must be some other explanation. What you can have is, Senator Moynihan said we should be at least in agreement about the facts, even if we have a different opinion. The things I'm saying, that there are these individuals who go into a possessed state, speak all of a sudden perfect Latin, which they never studied, or any other language for that matter, exhibit enormous strength, have hidden knowledge. There's a Latin word for that, latra, where they can understand and tell you things about your past life. This possessed Satanist, for instance, she told me that my mother had died of ovarian cancer many years earlier. There's no way she would have of knowing that, but it wasn't just me. She told many people things like that about their lives. And then she was the one who levitated during the exorcism, according to 8 people. That I didn't actually go to the exorcism, even though I knew her quite well. And then you have to make a judgment, Cameron. What is the most plausible explanation here? As with the woman who claimed she was very, very credibly claimed she was being beaten up by evil spirits, you have to make a judgment. And
can you imagine saying with a straight face, this woman very credibly claimed that she was being beaten up by evil spirits? Like, yes, that sounds very credible. Anyway, yeah, no, he doesn't draw it back. He just says, well, but in other cases, there were like levitations and languages that they shouldn't have been able to speak. I mean, that's like, how does anyone not see through how ridiculous that is? What evidence do you have that my client is guilty? Well, this other person did this crime and this crime, and we have good evidence that this other person committed these other crimes. Yeah, but what does that have to do with my client? Can you show that my client is guilty? Well, these other people did these other crimes, and we have evidence for those. Wait, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with anything? Anyway, but these other claims that he... Sorry, something happened to my microphone. Can you still hear me in chat? Can you let me know? I don't know what happened to my microphone there. I'm hoping you can hear me now. I'll just wait a second because I don't want to talk and lose everything. That would be rather pointless. Come on, there must be someone there. I don't know if I can check live. Okay, yes, you can hear me. It's just a bit of a delay. Yeah, I'll try not to hit my microphone cord. Anyway, what I was saying is that a bit different. Oh, no. Okay, so I think it may have reverted to my web. No, it's still taking it from this. A bit loud, a bit clearer. Huh, that's weird. Anyway, so what I was saying is that, so these claims about levitation and speaking in a language that's not known and knowing things that that you shouldn't have known, these claims will obviously have to be addressed, and I think we'll see more of those over the course of the interview. But notice that the one about levitation, he wasn't actually present at that, so we don't even have his first-person word from it. He says that something like 8 people observed that. Now, there are magicians who can levitate things, or at least make things appear to levitate. So the fact that witnesses can be convinced that something is levitated isn't itself that convincing to me. What you want to ensure is that the conditions are controlled. And the problem is with these things like levitation or feats of extreme strength, for that matter, that they have never been and cannot be demonstrated under controlled conditions or recorded in a way that can be verified. It's only ever reports, and often like second or third hand reports, as in this case, where he didn't observe the levitation himself. It's only reports in uncontrolled conditions of these things happening, which raises all these questions about the reliability of eyewitness testimony and memory biases and contamination and things like that. So I've written about that in my book. I don't buy any of these claims unless they can be demonstrated under controlled conditions. And the thing is, if there really was such a thing as demonic possession, which was investigated by all of these exorcists in the Catholic Church and these doctors who consult them and so forth, if that was true, then you would expect that there'd at least be one or two cases now and again where they found, yes, actually, this person is like super legit demon possessed, and then we can bring them into a lab and either elicit or even just sort of allow those phenomena to be manifested and recorded on camera and witnessed by scientists on controlled conditions, and where there's no possibility of fraud or mistakes or anything like that. But it's just that never happens. That has never happened. James Randi Educational Foundation offered $1 million prize for many years for anyone who could provide this sort of evidence for any paranormal or supernatural condition, and many people tried, but no one was able to. I don't think that prize is offered anymore. But the point is that there would be huge incentive to do this, and it seems like if the phenomena is real, that you should be able to do this, even if it's rare, and even if most cases maybe don't last long enough or whatever. But it's like someone would be able to find this, right? There are super rare diseases that we can still study because they happen sometimes, and then they can be documented and investigated. I just don't buy it that somehow these phenomena are real, but they just can never be investigated under controlled conditions. We never get an example in the lab or a good video recording or anything like that. It's always this sort of hearsay evidence. It's just not convincing. And this comes back to the question, well, is Dr. Gallagher here really skeptical? Because if you were really skeptical about these things, it seems like you would raise these sorts of questions about, how come no one has been able to find controlled evidence of any of these types of supernatural things happening? That's kind of weird, right? Like, wouldn't you expect that to exist if it was actually real? Shouldn't we be trying to get this sort of evidence? Anyway, let's keep going, and we'll hear him talk a bit more about that.
Skepticism can go so far that you realize that the position of, you might say, agnosticism is an excuse for not really accepting reality. I always quote Blaise Pascal, the great mathematician and genius, who was a very serious Catholic. He himself felt he witnessed a miracle of his niece, and he said, "Look, God gives us the evidence. He's never going to give us the evidence 1 and 1 equals 2. Of that certitude. He's going to give us the evidence that he thinks we should have." So when people talk about the gospel miracles or the resurrection or the miracles of Lourdes or all this, God, our Lord, gives us a certain amount of evidence, and we have to make a judgment. People can be so, let's say, rigorous about it that they ignore all kinds of evidence.
Wouldn't it be so rigorous that we ignore evidence? I think the question to ask Dr. Gallagher here is the evidence that you have experienced or that you have available in favor of demonic possessions, would that be sufficient to establish the phenomenon as a real condition, and publish that in a medical journal? And the answer is obviously no. I mean, there are journals that will publish this crap, but not legitimate medical journals. The answer is obviously no. And then the question will be, well, then are we really being too skeptical if we're just applying the same standard that's used in the rest of medicine? This is, I think, a good question to ask, particularly these people from a medical background, because they do have a knowledge of, this guy's a clinician, not a researcher, but he'll still have some knowledge of, the medical science and publishing norms and research practices and things like that. And they know that they can't even come close to meeting the standards that are used in their own disciplines. So the thing is, I don't think they can't reasonably say that you're holding to a too high a standard, because all you're doing is applying the very same standard that they adopt in their own discipline. And I think that this is a way to get around the claim that, you're just being hyper skeptical. No, all I'm doing is holding your demonic nonsense to the same standard as the rest of your clinical practice at least should be held to, and hopefully is held to, according to your own training and the standards that you endorse. And then when you do that, I think that you sort of really illustrate the cognitive dissonance that's going on. But they just try to avoid that by whenever you say, well, hang on, couldn't there be things that we don't understand here? Just saying, oh, well, no, that's too skeptical, right? You just have to accept reality as it is. It's just a cop-out.
Well, that's their choice. Pascal said, God gives enough evidence for the well-meaning person to get the point.
There's so many different directions I want to go, but I've got an outline of questions that I had planned to ask you, so I'm going to continue to work through those, and then we'll touch along some of the things that you've mentioned along the way. So what I'd like to turn to is the case that you discussed in the book with Julia. It was one of the more captivating accounts that you described, especially at the very beginning, your introduction to her. Why don't you go ahead and explain the experience that you had with your cats for the audience?
I did highlight this case of a woman I called Julia. All the facts in that chapter are 100% accurate, other than the fact that I don't say where.
Yeah. So just for those who may not know, when he talks about the chapter and so forth, he's referring to a book that he wrote. They sort of spruik it at the start. I just skipped that point. So yeah, Dr. Gallagher's written a book about his work with demons, possession, and so forth. So that's what he's referring to.
Where she's from. She was not from the New York area, nor do I give her real name. There were three amazing aspects of the case, which is one of the reasons I highlighted it in the book. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons that they're making a Hollywood movie out of her. You may know the name Jason Blum.
When they're making a Hollywood movie out of a demonic case that you investigated, yeah, that really increases the credibility of what you're about to say. But anyway,
he's a big producer in Hollywood, and he told me this is one of the best stories he's ever seen for a movie. So careful where you tread. But I decided I would participate in a movie with him. I mean, it's a feature movie; it's not a documentary. So long story short, it's a fascinating case. It was fascinating to me because even in the view of the exorcist, including this Father Jacques as well as another exorcist who was the chief exorcist, they said to me, "Rich, this is a once-in-a-century case. I mean, even for a possession, this is the most flamboyant case they had ever seen." So I knew I was dealing with. I mean, I had to verify it myself, being a little skeptical. Having said that,
just a little.
It became obvious to me very quickly that she was possessed. I saw her in possessed states. Number two. And as an explanation for why this happened to her, and she knew she was possessed. She was a fairly intelligent woman, not highly educated, but intelligent. And she was possessed because she was one of these rare Satanists. I mentioned earlier, Cameron, that there sometimes is exaggeration about Satanists. You still see that in the news nowadays. People exaggerate Satanists being all over the place, or causing all havoc in circles where they probably have nothing to do with. But this was the real deal. This was one of the real cult Satanist members. Not a nice bunch, who literally worship Satan. And since she did literally worship Satan, she was somewhat surprised that she became possessed. Interestingly, she wanted to get rid of the possession while remaining a Satanist, which is a contradiction in terms. I mean, you can't seek help to get an exorcism while you're going to remain a Satan worshiper.
It's interesting that Christians can become possessed, or at least oppressed. I'm not entirely sure about that distinction, and I don't know that he is either, although he claims to make that distinction. But so Christians can become possessed or oppressed, but then when Satanists become allegedly possessed, it's like, oh well, you should expect that, right? When you engage in, I don't know, whatever practices that they are engaging in. It doesn't really say here. It seems a little bizarre to me. Like, what is it exactly that you can do to facilitate an evil spirit possessing you? Like, why would it be? I don't know what sort of rituals they're doing, like pentagrams, or like they chanting some things, or like, how does any of that relate to the ability of the spirit to possess your body? It just doesn't really seem to have any connection to it. I mean, if anything, it would seem to be your mindset that would be most relevant. It's like, I don't know, if you think evil thoughts, you get possessed or something, but that doesn't seem to have anything directly to do with worshiping Satan. I don't know. I don't know how any of this is supposed to work, or how what the theory is supposed to be. So it's just a bit of a mystery how worshiping Satan is related to this at all. But anyway, let's hear what
That's
happens.
a whole other story. So basically, the priest, again, this Father Jacques, wanted me to evaluate her, not because he was unclear about her being possessed. He and several other mental health professionals had already confirmed to their satisfaction that she was possessed.
What sort of mental health professionals are they consulting there? Oh, yes, to their satisfaction, she's possessed. You might want to seek different help there.
But because she was ambivalent about getting help, as I said, she wanted to be relieved of her possession. On the other hand, she did not want to leave the cult. So this was obviously a problem. You might say it was a type of ambivalence. And they wanted me to talk to her and discuss that with her and see if there were, also psychological or emotional reasons why she was remaining with the cult. So I came to know her quite well. And I would say a third amazing fact about this case is she did treat me honestly and respectfully. And at the end of our working with each other, I mean, again, these are not patients of mine. I mean, these are not people I'm treating as patients. But depending on the situation, I'm diagnosing and or giving them a little understanding of their problem. At the end of our working together, she said to me specifically, she said, well, Dr. Gallagher, I know you've tried to be very helpful to me. If you want, you can write about this case and talk about this case. Just protect my name and my identity, which I've always done, of course. The long and the short of it, when I first met her, I think that was part of your question, Cameron. My wife and I were in our bedroom in our suburban house, and it was 3 a.m., interestingly enough. And The two
How
cats.
long ago was this? Sorry to cut in.
This is a little more now than 25 years or so.
It's 3 a.m.
We've always had pets, and we had two cats, and they used to sleep at the end of our bed, and they were quite well-behaved cats. Cats can be a little ornery, but you know, they were on the gentle and well-behaved side. And all of a sudden, we were awakened by these two cats fiercely fighting each other. Never seen ever before or since. To the point that they were scratching and clawing each other, going at each other like prize fighters, and we had to separate them. And we really didn't know what was going on. I mean, was this catnip, or had they eaten something bad? You know, we chalked it up to some kind of natural cause. As it turned out, the next morning, actually to my annoyance, the priest brought this woman, whom I call Julia, to my house. I later told him in no uncertain terms, do not bring Satanists to my neighborhood, okay? So they ring the doorbell, I trudge down the stairs, and Father Jacques, somewhat sheepishly, says to me, well, Dr. Gallagher, I'd like to introduce you to this woman I've been telling you about, Julia. And Julia looks at me with a smirk and says, out of the blue, oh, hi, Dr. Gallagher, nice to meet you. By the way, how did you like those cats last night? Now, you can imagine I was taken aback. I was taken aback so much by her comment that I didn't really express to her the annoyance I had if she had anything to do with this. I'm thinking, you know, how is this possible that she knew that? I'd never met her before. So anyway, that was the start of my dealings with the Satanist Julia. We had many conversations. She exhibited a lot of, even outside of her possessed trances, she exhibited a lot of, let's call it, psychic abilities. What is a good example? For instance,
Yes, I mean, that story about the keep hitting my microphone. That story about the cats is extremely unbelievable. I don't know where that originally came from, but he's talking about something that happened, he said, like 25 years ago now. It would be a bit more compelling if he'd written about it sooner after the event. Maybe he did. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know what the first record of that kind of story is. But I strongly suspect that that is a some kind of contaminated or mixed up memory there. For example, possibly he told her the story and then he forgot about it and she asked about it another time and he's mixing up the occurrences. That sort of thing is very common in terms of recollection. At least I think that's a better explanation than someone became possessed. So a Satan worship became possessed by a demon who then started somehow causing the cats of someone she didn't know to get angry with each other at 3 a.m. in the morning. Yeah, okay, that's a really plausible explanation. Yeah, yeah, that's very credible.
She would often tell me that she had the ability of what.
Yeah, that's also possible, right? So, I mean, if she was brought to his house, she could have smelled the cats or noticed cat hair or something like that and just asked something about his cats. And then he made that connection and then misremembered it later on. Like, there's so many possibilities here that the thing is, the entire story relies on the fact that she asked about it before he told her. And so all that has to happen is for her to have mentioned something about cats and him slightly misremember the order of things or make an association that didn't actually occur at the time. And then the whole story is explained purely in terms of like misremembering the specifics. And that's so easy to do and so much more plausible than this convoluted nonsense about a Satanist being demon possessed and then doing something with the cats of someone at 3 a.m. in the morning that she didn't even know, but then happened to visit next morning. Like, what even is this? Like, since when did demon possessed people even have power over random cats who were not even anywhere near them? Like, what? That's now one of the symptoms as well. We add that to our list alongside speaking in languages, knowing things that they shouldn't, levitation, bruising, and power over random cats. What is this?
What the parapsychological crowd calls remote viewing. In other words, they claim there's this kind of occult third eye in their mind and they can see people at a distance. It's all kind of occult mumbo jumbo, but it's a real phenomenon in certain people, often people who are occultists, as she was. So she told me about this a couple of times, and then once she said, you know, I can see the chief exorcist at the moment. The chief exorcist was, I'm 6'5", I'm a big guy. This guy was even made me look small. He was a 6'7" ex-Marine, and he was going to be the chief exorcist on the case, not Father Jacques. And she said, well, I can see, he called himself Father A. It was good.
Yes, this is a good point. He's the demon version of the alien guy on the History Channel. I'm not saying it's demons, but it's demons.
Kind of a nom de guerre, sort of a pseudonym for because he wanted to remain anonymous. Again, people know who it was if they really know the scene at the time in America, but I continue to call him by the name he used, Father A. So she said, I can see Father A at a distance. I knew where he was. He was 100 miles away, and he usually lived at this rectory. And I said, yeah, what is he doing? And Julia said to me, well, he's walking along a beach not far from his house, and he's saying his, I think she said he's saying his mumbo jumbo prayers. By that she meant he's saying his daily breviary, divine office, which priests say. And I said, what is he wearing? And she said, well, he has a blue windbreaker on, and he has khaki pants. I mean, there's absolutely no way she would know that. And I said to her, I think I could joke around a little bit with her at the time. I said, well, Julia, Miss Smarty Pants, I'm going to call him on the cell phone right now. So I called him, and he didn't know why I was calling. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm usually at the rectory, but I decided I would take a little drive to the beach and say my prayers, the divine office, walking along the beach. And I said, and what are you wearing? And he said something to me like, who wants to know? And I said, just humor me, Father. He said, well, I have a windbreaker. What color? Blue. And I have my khakis on. And it actually dawned on him, because he knew I was in the process of evaluating Julia. He said, oh, I know, Rich, what's going on. You're talking to Julia, and she's describing me, right? He said she would have no way of knowing what I was doing. And I said, yes, well, that's a very good guess on your part. So she had these psychic abilities. She would go into trances occasionally, and I would actually witness.
Yeah, so we can add another list of phenomena to the rapidly growing compendium of powers that demon possession allegedly confers. So this one is, I guess, remote viewing, being able to see something that's distant from the location one is currently at. So I don't quite know why demons would have that power. If they're possessing you, right, then they're like embodied in you, right? How can they then see something that's not located where they are? I don't really understand how that's supposed to work. But of course, there's no attempt to give a theory that's coherent about any of this. At least Dr. Gallagher hasn't. Maybe some Catholic theorists have come up with this somewhere else, but I never hear it articulated as to how any of this is supposed to work in terms of what the demon's power has and how that fits in with their possession and so forth. I mean, if the demon is a spirit that possesses your body and essentially takes control over it, or partial control or something like that, then how is it then able to see something that's, many miles away? It doesn't really make sense. But I don't know. Apparently that just happens. In terms of explaining this story, once again, I think that it's likely a memory contamination. The only thing that is remarkable about it is essentially the order. So Dr. Gallagher says that Julia knew about the attire and location of this other person before he told her about it, or before she could have known it through some other means. But we're entirely reliant on him in remembering that and in drawing that connection correctly. If he's muddled the order of events somehow, or combining different events, because this was many years ago, we know, or possibly Julia found out about the fact that this guy goes down to the beach maybe more often than he admits, and actually maybe she saw a photo, or she actually heard him mention it another time. Like, there's so many possibilities here. We don't have access to enough of the facts to really verify any of them. But again, are they more is that a more parsimonious explanation than, well, a demon possessed her, which then remote viewed this like guy, and then she was able to report that for like no clear reason? It boggles the mind as to how anyone can think that is the best explanation for this.
The demonic voice, often very nasty, hostile to anything sacred or religious. Once the demonic voice called the other priest, Father Jacques. I'm not going to try to imitate it, but it's clearly using the vocal cords of the individual, but it sounds a little different. So in this guttural voice, it said something to the effect, "We told you to leave her alone, you monkey priest. She's ours. You'll never get her." And I always have interpreted that's how they think of human beings. They think of us as monkeys, as animals. In this case, probably as evolved monkeys, or at least evolved primates. And
Dr. Gallagher, I've got some bad news for you. I've got some bad news about the place of humans in the evolutionary tree of life. Anyway, maybe he missed that day at medical school when they talked about evolution.
And they are sadistic towards human beings. I mean, they really hate God, but they hate the fact that we're made in the image of God and that we have the ability still to follow God, which they've renounced, and they've made their choice. In other words, they have renounced God. It's not like God rejected them. They renounced God, so God allows them to go to whatever unhappy fate they now experience. So in any case, what I'm saying is,
isn't that kind of a prick move on God's part? Like, if God is all loving and all powerful, wouldn't he want to do everything he could to, try to bring them back? Or is it's like, well, if you reject me once, it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. It's like what is it? Hell has no fury like a woman scorned or something like that. But it's like a God scorn. It's like, yeah, if you reject me, screw you. Anyway, that's a deeper question, but I've never really understood that logic that, well, if you reject God, he just like lets you do whatever. Like, he doesn't actually try to reach out to you and keep trying. He's just like, you can go screw yourselves, and randomly possess people and, spy on the beachwear and like make their cats fight each other. It's like, oh my
God. Her case was incredibly dramatic. They all going to make a movie out of it, which is okay with me. I mean, I'm not a particularly materialistic person. I don't really care about a movie being made, but I think it's probably going to do some good in publicizing this kind of dramatic case.
Yeah, because as if we really need more publicity about these extremely evocative and over-the-top possession cases. That's not something that's already suffused that popular culture is already suffused in already, and that we need more of these. It's just ridiculous.
Julia, the one where she levitated during an exorcism?
Yes, and again, I have talked to, and of course, it's been reported all throughout history. Not just in possessions, by the way, but also by occultists, and sometimes even in the lives of saints. The question is, does that in the lives of saints, does that come from God, or does that come from some kind of demonic trick? That's a whole other controversy. But the fact of the matter is, 8 or 9 people, including a couple of nurses and salt of the earth people, as well as the 2 priests, obviously, they all swore to me that for a half an hour during the exorcism, which was quite dramatic. She had several exorcisms. This was the last one. Quite dramatic. She was speaking foreign languages. The room became cold. The room became hot. And for about a half an hour, all these salt of the earth people told me that she levitated out of the sort of comfortable chair that she was being held down on for about a half an hour, for about a foot off the air. They were convinced that if they didn't hold her down.
A foot off the air. That's not really that pronounced, is it? I mean, I've seen people who can appear to levitate just by kind of the way that they sit on the chair, like they sort of hold themselves up and doesn't look like they're doing it. I could easily imagine that in a highly charged exorcism scenario that people convince themselves that that's what's happening, and then they report it later. Again, we have ample, I haven't looked specifically at levitation, but we have ample documentation of these sorts of things happening, of people convincing themselves. I think faith healings are the most obvious example of this, right? Where people say, oh, he or she was miraculously healed, and they got up and walked out of their wheelchair, and then you see the video and there's like 3 people holding onto them, and they like barely managed to get out of their chair, and they're like shaking, and they walk like 2 steps and fall over, and that's reported as, oh, they were healed and they got up and they walked without any problems. It's like you can literally compare in these rare cases where you actually do get the video evidence what the reports are with what the actual reality was, and it's it's night and day. And speaking in tongues is another example of this, where people say, oh, he's spoken this foreign language or fluently in a language that no one can understand. And then you hear it and it's just like complete gibberish nonsense syllables that it's like clearly not any language, or it's just gibberish. Glossolalia, which is speaking in tongues, has actually been studied a fair bit. That's another example of this sort of phenomena that has been documented, because we can produce glossolalia under controlled conditions. And when you do that, you find it's just people play acting. It's just gibberish. Or possibly half-remembered bits of languages that they're just sort of mushing together. And so it's an interesting phenomenon psychologically about sort of how it happens. But the point is, whenever you can actually dig into these sorts of types of miracle phenomena, you actually find that people are terribly unreliable about reporting the specific details and capturing what actually happened. That's why you need reliable scientific evidence under controlled conditions about precisely what happened. Like, what do we mean exactly by levitating? So like there was a gap between any type of support, so you could like pass a rod right under her, of 30 centimeters or something like that. He said a foot. Is that what we mean by levitation? So if we got all the witnesses in and talk to them separately, like they'd report that was the case, or like what position were they standing in the room? Could they verify that? Was she not like maybe sitting in an odd way, or like partly standing up or something? Were they paying attention closely? Did they all report this immediately afterwards, or did they talk to each other afterwards and then there's a memory contamination issue? How long afterwards were they interviewed, or did they report this? There's all of these questions there that you would, as a reasonable skeptical person, want to have addressed before you could be very confident about this. Of course, this happened so long ago and we don't have the details that we can't we can't assess it. There's just not enough information. So we just have to say, I don't know exactly what happened, but I can imagine a lot of different scenarios. And unless we have controlled, unless this can be reproduced or something similar can be reproduced on controlled conditions, we're just going to have to point to possibilities without being able to say specifically. But what I think we can reasonably say is that demonic possession is a terrible explanation, because again, why would a demon possess someone and then levitate a foot off a chair? But what's the point of that? What does it have to do with anything? It just, like, I thought demons beat people up or make cats angry at each other or helps you to spot someone on the beach for like 100 miles away or whatever. Why are they now levitating people just a foot off the chair? It's not even an impressive levitation. An impressive levitation is, like on the ceiling or something. I don't know. People remember Mary Poppins, where they, the bankers start laughing near the end and they're like literally hanging up at the ceiling. Now that's an impressive levitation, like a foot off the chair. Come on. Like that's weak sauce levitation. Why even bother at that point? So it's just nonsense being thrown out and hoping something sticks. It's like, oh, it's cats, or it's a weird language, or it's being angry, or it's looking at the people on the beach, or it's levitating 1 foot off the chair. None of these things have any connection to each other. There's no explanation as to what holds them together, why they are reflective of demon possession, and they're all easily explicable in terms of much simpler phenomena, largely memory distortions, as well as maybe people not paying enough attention and having an expectation bias and other things like this. It's just baffling that anyone can think that this is sufficient evidence to think that this establishes that demonic possession is real.
Which was very hard, and they were sweating to hold her down. That if they didn't hold her down, she would have risen to the ceiling or something.
Cases of oppression, the one that you mentioned earlier where the bruises show up and everything, those seem like maybe there's some sort of natural explanation for that. There could be some kind of medical condition that we just don't know about. And maybe that's just my ignorance of the field. It could just be in my ignorance of the human body. But when it comes to cases of, the 3 things that you mentioned, levitation, that seems impossible to explain medically, right? Knowing things outside of what you should be able to know, that seems also impossible. And that also, I think, would apply to the case of ancient languages, knowing ancient languages. And then also, well, I guess the other one.
Yeah, well, Cameron, that's if you take all of these things at their face value, which you shouldn't do. You should almost never just take things at their face value unless they're things that are very familiar to you in your everyday experience. There's books on my bookshelf over there. I can sort of take a face value that if it looks like they're there, they're probably there, right? That's something pretty ordinary and within my ability to interact with directly and replicate. And, other people can experience that as well. But if it seems like someone's levitating off a chair, or even if I think that I see someone levitating off a chair, I don't just think, oh, it looks like someone's levitating. Yeah, they're probably just levitating, especially in it's a highly charged, exorcism scenario. And we don't even have that, of course. We have reports of someone. So what we have is Dr. Gallagher is saying that he heard people say that they saw someone levitate 1 foot off a chair in an exorcism, however many years ago. That's what we have to work with. We don't have actual facts of people levitating. This is just being the failure to be skeptical and just taking something completely at face value as, oh, there was actual levitation. That can't be explained. No, all we have to explain is memories or reports of levitation 1 foot off the chair. That is very easy to explain, even if we can't be sure of the specifics in the actual case, because of course we don't have the details. But in general, you can explain that quite readily. It's just a lack of imagination that leads you to think that you can't. And a lack of skepticism.
That also sort of falls under that category as well. Although it was interesting, I think some point in the book, I think in the chapter with Julia, you also mentioned that she had the ability to wreak havoc.
Yeah, this is actually a good point, which I haven't mentioned. So I usually assume good faith. Well, when I say good faith, I mean I usually assume that there isn't deliberate, explicit fraud, but that happens as well. And actually, one issue here is that medical insurance fraud is a major problem. I'm not quite sure how levitation would be related to that, but at least in some of these cases, particularly in cases of alleged healings, someone is wheelchair bound and then suddenly they're not. We have to take seriously the possibility that there's some kind of insurance fraud going on there, or that people just want attention and other things like that. So those things absolutely do happen. Now, can't say whether it did in this particular case, and it's going to depend on the specifics as to whether you think that's more likely than memory distortions or other things. You're going to have to weigh that up. But the thing is, all of these things are more plausible than freaking demons, right? Like, and that's sort of what somehow people like Dr. Gallagher just don't see, even though they have no coherent theory to offer about why demons are a good explanation. To them, it's just, well, it's clearly, that's what the facts show.
There was another psychiatrist who evaluated her, and he didn't really get to know her. And he was, even though 3 mental health people had agreed before me that she was possessed, this guy was a skeptic. And there's always going to be skeptics, and I respect skeptics. I just think they often don't know the full story. And he wanted to put her.
So that's interesting. He now says that he's not a skeptic because he's clearly talking about them in a way that is excluding himself from that group. So interesting. He's a little bit skeptical, but he's not actually a skeptic. I mean, we kind of knew that anyway, right? But it's good to have that confirmed.
In a hospital, not so much that she needed to be in a hospital, but he thought that this was a way to evaluate her. And she was so annoyed at him. She said, what does this idiot think? I'm crazy? I'm not crazy at all. She said, if I had gotten in a hospital, trust me, I would have caused a lot of chaos. So exactly what she meant, it's hard to say, but I think she was perfectly capable of causing a lot of chaos.
That's actually very interesting if that report is accurate. I don't necessarily take anything that he says about these at face value, but I mean, he's already said that he is interested in someone making a movie out of one of the cases that he reported, and he's written a book about them. So these two things indicate to me that he does kind of like the publicity about this, at least to some degree. I'm not saying that's the only reason he's doing it, but he's certainly not averse to it. Otherwise, you don't write a book and agree to be involved in some kind of movie project. So the fact that he's said that is interesting. But the other point about this woman here, apparently there was this. I don't take anything that he says at face value. But that being said, there was a woman. This woman who was allegedly possessed came into contact with this other doctor who was an actual skeptic. Apparently, all these other ones weren't. And so, according to what Dr. Gallagher has just said there, this woman really didn't like this skeptic. You'd think if she was demonically possessed, she would really dislike the Christians and not the skeptic. But I don't know, whatever. But she was like, "Oh, I'm not going to go in hospital. I'm going to make a fuss. Do you think I'm crazy?" That to me, if that's accurate, really pushes me in favor of that. This was at least some kind. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not psychiatric in nature, but it pushes me in favor of some kind of attention-seeking behavior, because what she appears to have wanted is people who were buying into her, what I would call a delusion, that she was possessed by a demon. Whether she actually believed that herself or whether she just enjoyed the attention, impossible to say, right? But that's just really sus to me, that the person that she was really hostile to was the actual skeptic, and not it's like Christians who you would have thought maybe a demonically possessed person would be hostile to, or maybe just everyone, right? So that's interesting there. I mean, you've got to think about what are the motivations of people, whether they're consciously aware of them or whether they're not, because they're buying to their own delusions or things like that, and whether people just sort of like the attention that they get by portraying themselves as demon possessed, and if they're really hostile to people who don't accept that, then to me that's a bit of a red flag. But anyway, let's keep going.
Yeah, especially in the case of your cats. Okay, so let's kind of get
Cameron, let me get back to the point. So you're saying, like, in the possession, it's very dramatic, and that's true, and that convinces almost anybody who at least faces the facts honestly, which some people don't. Most people just ignore this type of thing. And you're right that sometimes the cases are so dramatic. But what you have to do is you have to recognize that this stuff exists on a continuum. And there are different types of oppression, for instance. Let me give you another example, if I may, of
Sure.
an oppression. Oppression can people have different terminologies for this. And the Italians call some of these cases vexations and stuff, like when people feel beaten up by evil spirits. I mean, I was convinced there was no other explanation, but human beings are ingenious. You can always come up with some explanation, right? But sometimes the phenomena of an oppression is also so dramatic that it's just very hard to figure out what other explanation there could be. So, for instance, another woman I write about in the book, she was a housewife, Catherine. Now, she had been involved in some nefarious stuff, which I won't go into when she was younger. She was a little bit flirting, one of these people flirting with
Just
sort of Satanism.
had to take my meds to keep the evil demons at bay. Let's keep going.
And she got possessed, and for a lot of other reasons, we discerned that she was possessed. Now, the way that her oppressive type of phenomena, because a lot of times these things start out as oppression and they proceed to possession, but I would say this is a kind of oppressive phenomena that I've seen in other people, is that the demons can affect their senses in selective ways. Now, there have been cases where demons have made people deaf. In her case, they made her deaf in a very selective way. So I call her in the book Catherine. And I was asked to evaluate her, and I said to Catherine, well, because I'd heard that she had this selective deafness, right? And I would say to her, well, Catherine, what did you do this morning? And she said, well, I went to the local food store. I got eggs and I got some potatoes. And then I said to her, because I'd been suggested to ask this of her, I said, did you go to church or did you pray today? And Cameron, she literally could not hear the second set of questions. And this was consistent, and it was an effort by demons to make sure that she wasn't getting any kind of spiritual help or solace or
Okay, so I don't think I heard this one when I first watched this. This is just, it gets dumber and dumber. She literally couldn't hear the question about whether she went to church. So this is another, we keep adding to this list of different powers or phenomena that demons can allegedly cause. And now we have, so sometimes they could augment senses by, like, you know, allowing you to see people on the beach, even at a, you know, when they're a long way away. But also they can kind of muffle your senses, in this case by preventing you from hearing very particular things. So that's interesting that demons also have that power. I'd be interested to know how that works neurologically. Like, does that occur at the level of the outer ear, the inner ear? Is it like a conduction issue, or is it like at the auditory cortex that's prevented? It'd be interesting to know what Dr. Gallagher has to say about that in terms of the neurobiology of demonically induced sensory deprivation or selective sensory deprivation, how that interaction works. Be some interesting papers there if we can sort of you know, work out that causal process there. But the other thing is, how on earth do you establish that someone can literally not hear what you have said? You know, it's like, doesn't every parent think that their toddler, you know, when they get to a certain age, is selectively deaf when you say, like, come here, or, you know, clean up for dinner or tidy your room or something like that? It's like, they never seem to hear that, right? It must be demonic possession. Maybe they're just not responding to what you're saying, or they're just ignoring you. Like, isn't that a simpler explanation than they're demonically possessed? It's like, how do you establish that they actually didn't hear it? You'd have to investigate that under such controlled conditions. It's like, I mean, you know, and there are certain psychiatric conditions where maybe she didn't even sort of realize that she was sort of neglecting that stimulus. Although, you know, I don't know that we even need to go that far. But the point is that to jump to, oh, it must be demonic possession that prevents her from responding to this. It's just like, what? This is so stupid. How could it? And it was the demon's attempt to prevent her from getting help. It's like, oh, come on. But apparently she still got help with her demonic possession, because, like, Dr. Gallagher saw her, right? So I guess the demon didn't do a very good job. It's unbelievable.
commiseration or advice. And so I was with a
teenagers too. They have this demonic possession.
We were both pretty taken aback by this phenomena, which I would regard, even though she was possessed, I would regard this as a kind of more typical oppressive phenomena where demons can affect cognition to an extent in the senses. And so we had the bright idea, thinking we were bright young doctors, of writing it out on a piece of paper, the questions. So on a piece of paper, I wrote Catherine, and normally she could see and hear perfectly. So I wrote on the piece of paper, Catherine, did you do anything else this morning? And she said, yeah, they had a pickup truck. And she said, yeah, I drove the pickup truck to the gas station and I filled it with gas. And then I wrote on this piece of paper, which I held up and was, you know, sort of showing to her, Catherine, have you given up faith in our Lord? And she looked at me both quizzically and with a disappointed look and said, Dr. Gallagher, why are you showing me a blank piece of paper? So it was obvious that the demonic world.
I'm going to use that one if someone tries to hand out like a you know, a Christian tract to me or a Bible passage. Like, why are you handing me a blank piece of paper? I didn't see anything. That's actually pretty good.
Was not only affecting her hearing in the selective way, but could even affect her sight in a.
Yeah, this is literally the three. Okay, I swear that the 3 a.m. thing. Like, is this guy actually having us on? Like, is this all a big troll? The 3 a.m. thing is so, like, you know, YouTube. I mean, that was a few years ago, wasn't it? Where it's like, you know, don't do this at 3 a.m. kind of thing. It's like I don't think this guy is that switched on to that sort of thing. And I don't get the sense that that would be the sort of thing that would explain this, especially the whole writing a book thing. But like, some of it is just so dumb that you just wonder if this could even be, if we're even supposed to take this seriously. But the thing is, a lot of people do take it seriously, which I'll show you later.
Selective way. That's the kind of things, whether it's a physical attack, you always hear, and sometimes you see in the movies where people all of a sudden get scratches or feel choked. That's a kind of external oppression, what the Italians call vexation. But they can also attack our inner cognition, our senses. And look, Cameron, when you see enough of these cases, you realize this, especially if the person, you know, is possessed, but even if they just have a serious oppression, you realize there's a pattern to it. You have to make a judgment. In medicine, we diagnose what we call a syndrome. And these diagnoses, they're not willy-nilly. They are clear recognition of a syndrome. They're very rigorous. This is why exorcists, at least in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, and often in sensible Protestant traditions,
the sensible ones.
You're not supposed to jump to the explanation of doing deliverance or an exorcism on a demonically attacked individual. You're supposed to have, in the words of the official Catholic manual, you're supposed to have moral certainty. In other words, it's sort of like beyond a reasonable doubt or something of that nature. They're rigorous diagnoses. We're not just making these discernments haphazardly.
Okay, so that's interesting because he explicitly compared this process of diagnosing someone with a demon possession or oppression to the process of diagnosing someone with a syndrome in medicine. Now, the thing there is that syndromes are defined by clusters of symptoms or like certain symptomologies that you have to have. So someone mentioned before the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the latest edition is the 5th edition, if I recall correctly. And that is used in clinical psychology and psychiatry to diagnose people with different mental health disorders or other conditions. And many of these are syndromes in the sense that they are diagnosed by, there's a checklist and you have to, I think they may have revised it slightly by how it works recently, but the basic idea is that there's a checklist of symptoms and you have to tick off a certain number on the list, or there's like 2 that you always have to have, and then there's like 3 of the next 5 or something like that. The point is that that's, there is a judgment call there in terms of like, well, why is it 3 and not 4 or 2 of the list, and like how severe is the symptomology and things like that. And we don't have a full understanding of the origin, the etiology of many of these sorts of conditions, because they're defined in terms of symptoms, not in terms of a particular organic cause or like pathogen or something. So he's sort of right in that sense that, this does involve clinical judgment. But the thing is that, we have a scientific procedure for this. That's why we have like 5 versions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual based on decades and like tens of thousands of papers, people debating about the definitions of different conditions and how to cluster them best. And, the psychological and behavioral and neurophysiological and neuroscientific basis of these conditions and how they interact with different drugs and how to best treat them and how they should best be understood in the light of our knowledge of psychology and neuroscience and so forth. What is there comparable for the justifying and validating the diagnostic approach to demonic possessions? I would like to know what the equivalent is, because it doesn't seem that there is one. I think that there is some kind of list that the Catholic Church endorses, which mainly appears to be one of exclusion, like, well, check if it's this, check if it's that, and if it's not any of those things, then like maybe it's a demon possession, something along those lines. He hasn't really tried to articulate what that is to us. I guess he's not an exorcist himself, so I don't know, maybe that's above his pay grade. But the point is that it's just embarrassing from my point of view for him to make this comparison, because he can't outline to us what this alleged diagnostic procedure is supposed to look like for demonic possession and what evidence there is backing this up, what literature substantiates the particular criteria and why they're being appealed to and how they're relevant and so forth. And he's making a comparison to something that, although highly imperfect, there's still a lot of criticisms like the DSM-5 and that approach, nevertheless is based on decades of research and a very large literature that attempts to improve the way that we classify these things. It does have a large evidential base. There's just no comparison here, right? One is at least attempting to apply good critical thinking and scientific reasoning, albeit imperfectly. And the other is just not even trying. Like there's no literature to base this on. There's no basis for why any particular symptomology is associated with demon possession or not. It seems that basically every case that we've been provided has a different symptom or a different behavior that's manifest. So we've had remote viewing, we've had levitation, we've had speaking different languages, we've had knowing things that you shouldn't know, we've had bruises that can't be explained, we've had cats fighting with each other, and then we've had, what was the one that you just talked about? Oh yeah, like not reading or hearing things. Like it's 7 completely different things that don't have any apparent relationship to each other. There's no theory here. There's no process for like what the inclusion or exclusion criteria are, except for, well, we can't think of any other explanation. So I guess it's got to be demons. It's just an absolute embarrassment. And for him to compare that to, the practice of diagnosing a symptom in psychiatry or even in other medical cases is just absolutely absurd. Like if that is an appropriate comparison, then show us like what's the demon DSM version and how can we, let's have a look at the papers and the citation and the evidence base for that. And maybe we'll take that slightly more seriously if you can actually show that, but it doesn't exist. And that's the thing. And it won't exist because the phenomena are so poorly defined. And it's basically just a grab bag of anything that can't be explained through other means. It's just completely ridiculous that he makes this comparison to me. My judgment call that I'm 100% sure that no one takes this seriously. Unfortunately, you're wrong about that because people do take it seriously, and I will show you proof of that in the comments to Cameron's video. Whether or not this guy takes it seriously, and I suspect that he does, but there are definitely people who do take it seriously.
So, as a physician, how do you go about ruling out certain psychiatric conditions in these different cases? What did you have like a rubric that you would go through, or did you develop like some kind of guideline that you would run through in each case?
Well, again, I'm a very experienced psychiatrist, so I just do my routine mental status and psychiatric history. I mean, I've evaluated. Somebody asked me the other day how many cases have I evaluated as patients. Remember, these are not patients of mine. These are people who are either sent to me by clergy often, and/or in this day and age have found me from, Malaysia to, California. California is very big on this paranormal stuff. So I get a lot of people from California who call me. Long story short,
That little remark there should be revealing. So, do demons just like California for some reason? Maybe it's the weather. Like the demons just kind of dig the agreeable weather in California, so they kind of hang out there more. I guess to Steelman, he might be saying that people are like more corruptible in California, so demons are easier. It's easier for demons to possess people. Like maybe there's more Satanists there. I don't know if that's what he was saying because, well, anyway, that raises a whole host of other questions that we don't have time to discuss here. But it sounded almost like he was saying that people are more interested in paranormal and sort of possession type stuff in California. And that's why we see these more cases, which is more consistent with the naturalist view that this is largely a kind of psychological, sociological phenomena that's affected by people's beliefs and expectations and things like that, and not an otherworldly phenomena that's primarily driven by the demons. I guess it depends on exactly what your theory of how someone becomes demon possessed is and when you would expect that to be more or less common. But at least the way he phrased that seems to me like, yeah, that's exactly what I would expect if this is in fact nothing to do with demons and all about humans. But anyway,
of the people in the normal course
California is hell.
of my, and people often ask me the question, well, how many psychiatric patients are demonically attacked? And I say, well, if they're a psychiatric patient, that doesn't imply that there's a demonic attack at all. So, for instance, in the course of my life, I responded to the person who was questioning me. I have probably evaluated. I mean, I used to be the county crisis director. I've evaluated thousands and thousands of cases, and probably over the years of my whole career, since my residency, I've evaluated maybe 27,000 cases or so. I haven't treated all these people, but I've evaluated them.
I remember at the start of this video, he said it was 25,000. It's gone up by 2,000 just over the course of the last 47 minutes. That's pretty impressive. I wonder what it's going to be at the end of the video. Oh dear. But notice that the question Cameron asked here is, what's the procedure that you use for evaluating these patients? And all we got is a rambling answer about, oh, well, I'm an experienced professional and I just use my normal routine. So what this tells me is that he does not have a procedure. He just sort of does whatever he does, right? This is actually, I think, extremely problematic. And I don't think that this is just an issue in sort of demon possession. I think that there has been a push in the medical field to be more kind of systematic and procedure based in terms of how they deal with patients, because otherwise it can be, in terms of like what things you test for or how long you spend with a patient and what things you look for can be affected by things like biases or your own preconceptions. And that leads to a lot of medical mistakes. And so there's a desire to kind of be a bit more procedural and kind of treat, not to treat everyone the same, there's a balance there, but to be a bit more kind of rigorous or procedural in the way that you apply different procedures and like what you test for. And he seems to be very much against that idea, because he wasn't able to articulate any kind of procedure that he followed. He just kind of, I just do my thing. Well, what is that exactly? Can you articulate to us what this looks like? Like, how do you assess? How do you exclude other possible explanations? I'm very underwhelmed by what he said. He hasn't convinced me in the slightest that he has any idea about how to go about this. He just seems to do whatever he does, and then at the end of it, he satisfies himself. I mean, he's already said before that in a number of these cases, he already went in believing that the person was demon-possessed, and the person who referred the patient to him also said that. So this seems to be almost routine in a number of cases, like the rubber stamp is like, we just got to get someone who's got an MD in front of their name to verify that they're, they don't have an actual psychiatric condition and so forth. The whole thing sounds ridiculous to me in terms of like, there doesn't seem to be any legitimate procedure that's followed here at all. And he's certainly not being able to articulate one. Something that was mentioned in the comments, actually, I think is probably right on the money here. Is it important that these are not his patients? Can he be more creative in his diagnosis when he doesn't have to follow his medical principles? Yeah, I was wondering about that as well. I don't actually know the legal status of a doctor seeing someone who is not their patient. Like, because he seems to, he was sort of saying that doctor-patient confidentiality comes into it here, because he's mentioned that a number of times. But if they're not actually his patients, does that still apply? Like, I don't entirely understand how this works, because what he was saying sounded to me like, I don't even know how it's ethical. Like, how can he just sort of how can he just give people medical advice which he has said that he is doing. He even mentioned diagnosing in some instances, who aren't his patients. Like, doesn't that become his patients if he's doing that? And doesn't that mean he has to follow certain guidelines and procedures, and he's like held to certain standards? I don't know. Like, I don't know how the legal side of it works, but it sounds at least unethical to me, irrespective of the legality. Like, if you're treating someone as if they're your patient, whether or not they're technically your patient, then I think that you should be held to quite a high standard in terms of how you treat them and the procedures you follow and so forth. And it just doesn't seem like he cares. He's so lackadaisical about this. Oh, I'm experienced. I just sort of, do my thing with them and whatever. Like, not good enough from my point of view. Absolutely not good enough. I think you owe these people more. And if you can't devote the time or won't devote the time or resources to that, then you shouldn't agree to see these people. You should pass them on to some professional who's actually going to treat them properly.
And none of those patients, none, were possessed. So even though I've seen over 100 possessions, which themselves are rare, I mean, I've lost count how many I've seen, and I've been to, although not in Julia's case, I've been to over 100 exorcisms, which are confined in the Catholic Church to possession. We don't.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if someone's not his patient, then he won't have access to their medical history notes. He won't know what drugs they're on or what they've been diagnosed with before. And so, I mean, how can you properly treat someone in that condition? I mean, I suppose he would know what they tell him, but is that going to be reliable and so forth? So yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of issues here that are like super problematic, I think, in terms of like bordering on abuse, particularly because some of these people might be attention seekers, but some of them, I think probably many of them are very vulnerable people, even if we don't know exactly what their particular condition is. It seems like even irrespective of the whole demon thing, a medical practitioner shouldn't sort of treat them or like see them and give them medical advice without being in a proper doctor-patient relationship with them. I don't even, it doesn't seem like that should even be allowed. But anyway, because again, he specifically, it's not like he's just talking to them. Unless he can talk to someone, but he specifically mentioned giving medical advice and diagnosis earlier. He used those specific words. So I don't know. The whole thing feels really dodgy to me.
Call it an exorcism unless the person is possessed, not oppressed. That's a whole different story. Then the percentage of people I evaluate is much higher that they're genuinely demonic attacked. But of these 27,000 patients, I mean, none of them were possessed. So it just goes to show you, it depends on the patient population. I don't expect, by the way, when I talk to priests or when I talk to doctors, I say, I don't expect you to come across these cases. I mean, I wrote the book because, these cases are rare enough that you have to have somebody who's seen a lot of them to draw these generalizations. And in fact, one of the reasons that it occurs too is because most of these people they're hardly stupid people. So they're not going to go to a doctor and say, well, demons are talking to me or demons are talking through them, because they know they're going to be put in the hospital. Just as Julia was kind of pissed off at the doctor for presuming that she should go into a psychiatric hospital. I mean, a lot of these people who have demonic attacks of different sorts, whether it's oppression or not, they say, well, I can't talk to a normal doctor. They'll just think I'm crazy. And there's a lot of truth to that, which is why they come to me in part.
Yeah, I mean, so that's basically an admission of guilt at this point. I mean, when I say guilt, I mean, it's almost that he realizes this. Like, people come to him, which is interesting because I thought that it was the priests who came to him or like the exorcist who came to him and not the people themselves. So that's a little bit confusing. Not the people who are allegedly possessed. But the point is, if they're looking for someone to validate either their attention-seeking behavior or their own delusion about being possessed or some combination of those, then obviously they're going to go to people who they think will validate that. So, I mean, and they're telling you that, like they're telling Dr. Gallagher that, I won't talk to my regular doctor or these, I won't go to the hospital or whatever it is because they won't believe me. Well, yeah, because they're not going to buy into your BS. They're going to treat it probably, well, hopefully like they should as some kind of delusion or attention-seeking behavior or some other condition that has another explanation. But if he's seeing people who are coming to him specifically for that reason, then it shouldn't be surprising to him that he's going to see some of these types of behaviors or phenomena that would otherwise be strange, because he's sort of selecting it. He's selecting himself to see people specifically because people are wanting him to validate those experiences or those behaviors. So that's also kind of highly problematic. And that can occur in other contexts as well, but he sort of doesn't seem to have realized that. Like he mentioned before about the idea that, well, these cases are rare, so you have to find someone who's seen a lot of them. But it's not just that he's happened to have seen a lot of them in the course of his work. People are seeking him out specifically to validate those experiences. So there's going to be a real selection issue here in terms of, it's not like he's just coming across them. People are people are trying to find him to validate those experiences. So you can't even take at face value the way these patients are presenting, because at least many of them apparently are looking specifically for him or someone like him to validate what they think they're experiencing or what they're presenting as. That's really problematic and really undermines most of the rest of what he said, as if it needed even further undermining. But there you go.
So kind of veering off topic. Well, it's not off topic at all, but I did have a question I wanted to ask you. Do you have a preference on which sort of denominational deliverance ministers that you work with? Do you prefer to work with Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, or Protestants in general?
Yes, I think this is a good point as well about the legality of it. So because they're not his patients, he doesn't attend the exorcisms and things like that. He it seems, can avoid any sort of legal responsibility for this. And I don't know if he probably gets patients to sign things depending on the circumstance. So it does appear to be that he's not, he's not actually willing to sort of, if you're going to take responsibility for your own actions, your opinions, your advice, then I think you should be willing to sort of put some skin in the game, right? And put yourself out there. But he's willing to like write books about it and give talks about it. But it doesn't seem that he's actually willing to put his skin in the game and like actually take these people on as patients or like actually attend the exorcism or anything like that. He's keeping himself at arm's length. At least that's consistent with what we've heard. And yeah, it really does seem that that's because he wants to avoid any possible liability for the fact that he's not giving proper medical attention or proper medical based advice to these people. The whole thing, just the more I hear about this, is just really seems extremely exploitative. And Dr. Gallagher is really coming across to me as someone who himself likes the attention. What's that based on? Well, it's based on what we've just talked about, the fact that he doesn't really seem to be trying to help these people very much, like not giving them proper medical advice, not taking them on as patients and so forth, not attending exorcisms. The fact he's written a book about it and is interested in this sort of movie deal about it, and the fact that he sort of likes these people seeking him out as someone who will take them seriously. These are all really red flags to me about, what his actual motivations here is. And that doesn't mean that he knows this is all hooey, by the way. He's probably convinced. He probably convinced himself many years ago. So, it is not mutually inconsistent.
Well, the tradition in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, as well as the Catholic tradition, these procedures. In fact, the Orthodox tradition has set prayers going back to St. Basil in the patristic era, and they have even more venerable prayers and procedures. So, by and large, Cameron, I would find that the Orthodox and mostly in the Western world, I would say the Catholics tend to have the most experience. That doesn't mean that I disrespect Protestant ministers clergy who also get involved in this. I mean, some of them are fundamentalists, some of them are seeing devils everywhere. C.S. Lewis himself said the danger is you need a balance. The danger is either not believing in demonic spirits, which a lot of people in modern times don't believe, versus being overly preoccupied and thinking that demons are causing everybody's headaches and upset stomachs and all that. So he said,
why is it unreasonable to think that a demon is causing my headache? Why is that less reasonable than anything else that's been said here? This is what I don't understand. Like, they'll appeal to some things as being obviously silly, but at least to me, that's no more silly than anything else that they've said. Like, how do they draw these distinctions? Why is that silly, but nothing else that he said is silly? I don't get it.
You have to find a balance. This was C.S. Lewis, excuse me, who was not a Catholic. So again, it's not that I don't agree that there are many Protestant, let's call them deliverance ministers, who do a lot of good work. I generally don't find that they tend to have the training and experience of, say, the Catholic Church priests who tend to go through a very rigorous training process. Again, that doesn't mean there aren't exceptions, and I don't really work as a team. It's not like I'm working as a team with these people, priests, clergy, including Protestant clergy, including rabbis, by the way, and some imams too. They ask my opinion, and I give my opinion, and that's sort of what I do. So it's not like I'm turning to any particular church tradition or even any religion, because you can get possessions no matter what the religion or lack of religion of the person is. In fact, if they have no religion and they're possessed, it's sort of worse because they don't know what the heck to do. They're in a dilemma. Doctor, I have this spirit controlling me, but I'm not religious. Who do I go to?
So I don't know if this is standard practice in other cases, but from what I've understood, in order to properly diagnose someone who has complex and difficult symptomology and sort of psychiatric or psychological conditions, you need to kind of get to know them. You need to understand what they were like before these symptoms emerged, what their context is, like who, their domestic environment, things like that. It's a process, and I know, it doesn't always get done as it should be, as it should be done. But I don't know how he can evaluate whether someone has a psychiatric condition or some kind of psychological condition if he just sort of, flies in, gives his opinion, doesn't work with the team, like doesn't really know the patient, doesn't work with him as a patient, and then just sort of leaves. It doesn't seem to me that he could possibly have enough background information to make that assessment properly. I mean, sure, there are certain tests you could do, and there's certain assessments you could make. I'm not saying you wouldn't know anything, but for these particularly difficult cases, like the woman with the bruises, for example, like you would have to know more about her environment and her baseline and her history and so forth, and that would just take time, and it would take talking to her regular physician or medical history and other things like this. How could you possibly? I don't know if maybe he did spend more time in that specific case. I've forgotten, because sometimes he seems to spend a lot of time with the patients, but then other times he just kind of seems to come in and leave. It's a bit confusing to me. It doesn't seem that it's very consistent. But the point is that that this idea that he doesn't really work in a team and he's not really seeing them as patients also undermines the credibility of his assessments, because you kind of need those things if you're to treat someone properly. Again, particularly when they have sort of complex and unusual conditions. There's only so much you can do if you don't know them, you don't have access to their records, and you haven't been treating them as a patient, and you probably don't have very long with them. I mean, how much of an assessment can you make in those sorts of cases? It's almost the more he says, the less credible anything that he has said becomes. That this whole methodology seems completely flawed to me. In order to make this assessment properly, what you would need to do is have a longer, lengthier assessment of the patient, ideally by someone who has access to their records, can talk to their previous doctors or the current doctor, and can investigate their family background and things like that. It would be a more lengthy process to really understand their conditions and what's sort of led them to this, to make a proper assessment. And that takes time, and then they would be treated in an appropriate way and recommended the appropriate care. Now, even if somehow we thought that there was demons involved in that, like there would be a process, and there would be a diagnostic procedure, and you would follow that procedure, and you would do the due diligence, and you would stay involved in the process. What you wouldn't do is go, oh, hey, can you come and look at this random person that you've never met before and tell me if they're crazy? And you fly in there, nah, they're not crazy, must be a demon. Okay, thanks. Can I use this for my next book deal? Yeah, sure, no worries. Like that seems to be much closer to, like, I'm barely even exaggerating. That's almost exactly what he said about one of his cases, right? It's just unbelievable that he seems to have convinced himself that this is a legitimate process for establishing whether people are demon possessed. The whole thing is an absolute joke. And I mean, from what I've heard, most Catholics even don't take this seriously. Some do, of course, but anyway, it's not surprising how absurd this whole thing seems to be, how it works.
So, and then they have to make a decision about that. I respect their freedom of religion. So it's a long answer to a question. It's sort of complicated. It's not like there aren't many fine Protestant people involved in the deliverance ministry. The one thing I insist is that you find somebody who is well trained, and that you find somebody who doesn't charge for this. In other words, there are televangelists who parade people in front of the camera. There are certain deliverance ministers who charge a lot of money. That woman who originally went to a Protestant deacon, and the demon manifested itself, and she threw the guy across the church hall. Eventually, she decided that she needed somebody more experienced, and she got it. She went to the Catholic Church. But she also had told me that at one point there was a very prominent televangelist who did deliverance, and this particular gentleman said to her, "Well, I'll do an exorcism if you give me $5,000, or you can appear on my TV show." And I said, "So what was your attitude?" She said, "I wanted nothing to do with that gentleman," and she was right. That's not the type of person you should seek out. You need to find a knowledgeable, holy clergy, and I would say it's perfectly fine to do it in a sensible denomination if you belong to one.
I thought Catholic exorcists were paid for their services. I mean, if you that other guy that Cameron interviewed who was an actual exorcist, I thought that was kind of his job, right? That he gets paid to exorcise people. But anyway, maybe that's different to what he's talking about. And I know that Dr. Gallagher is not himself an exorcist, and he was saying you shouldn't go to televangelists to get an exorcism. But apparently it's okay for him. So he didn't actually mention whether he's paid for this. That's somewhat unclear. I mean, I would have sort of assumed that he would be, right? He's basically a consultant. But even if he isn't, it's okay for him to have a book deal that comes out of this, and then maybe some kind of movie involvement. But it's not okay for a televangelist to say, "Oh, I'll exercise you if you appear on my program." I'm not really seeing the big difference there. Like, why is one okay but the other one is not? I don't really understand that. Anyways.
So I'd like to return.
Oh, and also, I mean, don't you have to have quite a lot of gall for, I assume this guy's a Catholic. I don't know if I think he may have said that earlier on, but he certainly seems to be. It takes a lot of gall for someone who's a Catholic or speaking on behalf of the Catholics to like take issue with someone else getting rich out of, getting rich out of offering religious services, shall we say? That it's a bit of pot calling the kettle black there, but I mean that's a whole can of worms. So maybe we'll just move on from that.
Turn to these cases of people speaking ancient languages that they had never studied. But before I do that, I want to remind the audience really quickly, if you missed the very beginning of this.
Yeah, well, exorcism for free bit donations welcome. Yeah, so who knows what that actually means.
This episode that we're doing a book giveaway today. So the first
this is his book,
new patrons
right?
that sign up on our Patreon, link is in the description of this video. Sign up
this has got, oh my gosh, this has got to be put on, right? This has to be a joke. Immediately after Dr. Gallagher has said, don't go in for people who will only exercise you to go on their TV show. Immediately after that, Cameron promotes his book giveaway of his stories of consulting about exorcisms. Like, it must be taking the piss. Like, you couldn't have scripted that. Is there no self-awareness, or is that like, is Cameron just sort of like, is this a bit of a nod to the audience who's paying attention? Like, what can you even say? Yeah, weird cover as well. It doesn't really scream demons to me, but anyway.
Tier 3 or higher, which is the $25 amount, we're going to send you a signed copy of Demonic Foes from Dr. Gallagher. He's going to personalize it with your name and everything. So if you'd like to take part in this book giveaway, then just become a new patron at the tier 3 or higher tier.
Sorry, I have to play this again. This is just amazing.
And I would say, type of Apollos said to her, well, I'll do an exorcism if you give me $5,000, or you can appear on my TV show. And I said, so what was your attitude? She said, I wanted nothing to do with that gentleman. And she was right. That's not the type of person you should seek out. You need to find a knowledgeable, holy clergy. And I would say perfectly fine to do it in a sensible denomination if you belong to one.
All right, money grubbing.
So I'd like to return to these cases of people speaking ancient languages that they had never studied. But before I do that, I want to remind the audience really quickly, if you missed the very beginning of this episode, that we're doing a book giveaway today. So the first 12 new patrons that sign up on our Patreon, link is in the description of this video. You sign up at the tier 3 or higher, which is the $25 amount. We're going to send you a signed copy of Demonic Foes from Dr. Gallagher. He's going to personalize it with your name and everything. So if you'd like to take part in this book giveaway, then just become a new patron at the tier 3 or higher tier on our Patreon page. And this is in addition to everything that you already get on Patreon. So if you go to our Patreon, you can see all the different things that you get at the different tiers. So just wanted to remind you of that. And then the question that I've got is related to the demon-possessed individuals that you've experienced. Have you personally experienced anyone speak?
Yeah, that's just special. Like, you can't make this stuff up, right? It's like money grubbing bad. By the way, here's our giveaway. If you're on this tier on Patreon, then you'll get a chance to win the book of this guy that we're. All right. Yep. And we as the atheists are the ones who are supposed to have all these nefarious motives. Like, oh my gosh.
Speaking a language that they didn't previously know. That's my first question. The second question is, if you have, how did you know that they hadn't studied that language previously? How did you rule that out?
Yes, good question.
Well, again, Cameron, sometimes it's obvious. So I've heard foreign languages spoken by possessed people many times, especially during exorcisms. Often it's Latin in a Catholic ceremony. It's almost like the person is mocking the church, showing, look, I'm smarter than you.
So if you have someone from a Catholic background and they're speaking Latin, maybe they've heard Latin before in a Catholic context. Like, just maybe that's a possibility. Maybe they haven't studied it, but they may have heard it before and they may be able to repeat some phrases. Of course, we don't have any details on how much they said, like how many different words were there, how fluent was it. Of course, none of those details seem to be ever recorded. It's just always, they spoke it. You can speak a language by saying like 5 words that make a sentence. That doesn't mean that you know the language. Maybe you just picked up that phrase from somewhere or other. Like, je ne sais quoi is French, but I didn't freaking speak French. Like, I just know that phrase. So we never have these sorts of details. I've never ever heard that reported as to like specifically what exactly they said. Like, what were the words, how much they said, how fluent it was, how well was it pronounced, things like this. But particularly if it's a case of, someone in a Catholic context spoke a bit of Latin. I wonder where could they possibly have gotten some Latin from? I can't think of anything. It would be much more impressive if they spoke something like ancient Assyrian, that like like there's 3 people in the world who study this who speak a language like that, and it's a dead language. Now that would be impressive, if we found cases of that, rather than Latin or other very common Latin's not very common, but like in a Catholic context is kind of common, or other common languages that someone might speak that they could have picked up from who knows where. This is the thing, you can't verify, you can't validate that they couldn't have learned the language in any other context. The best case for that would be languages like ancient Assyrian or something that's truly dead and that basically no one speaks. Now that would be a good case, but I've never heard of cases like that have actually been, well, not that any of them have really been documented, but it somehow it's always Latin or something that's fairly readily explained. It's just, again, it's so easy to come up with I think fairly plausible explanations for how we can account for these reports, and yet somehow it's like, oh, this is so amazing, it must be demons. And by the way, why do demons know how to speak these weird languages? And why would they want to do that? What does that have to do with anything? I guess he said here it's mocking, but why would speaking in Latin be mocking? Wouldn't it be more mocking if you just said in English the mock that you want to make, like, haha, you're all fools and monkeys, or whatever he said before? Like, isn't that a bit of mocking? I don't know. The point is that it just seems really ad hoc. Like, you could kind of make anything up and say, oh, that's why the demon's doing it. It's a bit of a joke. But also, why is it that demons are better at speaking languages than humans are? Like, we're the ones who actually have brains. Like, you'd think that would give us an advantage in like thinking and remembering, but apparently it's better to not have a brain, and then you just like speak all sorts of languages. I don't know. Seems a bit unfair to me.
Demon speaking. I'm smarter than you. I can speak better Latin than you can. But it really could be any language. And people are surprised when I say that.
Yes, this is a good point as well. I mean, even if you study languages, you can misidentify them. Some languages sound very similar to each other. Depends on the listening environment and how well you heard them and so forth. And of course, especially given the other statements that this man has made, I do not take it at face value that he can understand these things. Like, does he himself speak Latin, for example? He hasn't actually told us. Sure, you might know some phrases of Latin, but that doesn't mean that you can really know that someone's speaking Latin. And by the way, if you know the phrases of Latin, maybe the other person picked them up as well, even though they don't speak the language. So again, when Cameron asked him a question about basically like, how do you know this, or what are the criteria? The answer that we get is just a puff of the chest, and like, well, I'm an expert. Well, I know how to do these things. I follow my, I just follow my clinical practice that I've done for 27,000 patients. Or well, I know because I've heard many examples of languages. That's not actually an answer. The answer would be that you articulate specifics or give details or explain your procedure. Like, if someone's speaking a foreign language, maybe actually get someone who really is fluent in that language, ideally a native speaker or someone who has studied it a long time, and get them to write down what they're saying, for example. Ideally in a blinded way, like, don't tell them that this is a demon possession. Just say, oh, what's this person saying? Get them to write it down. Like, that would be more convincing to me. There's still issues there, but that would be much better than what we have. Or, of course, record them and then pass the recording on to someone, get them to transcribe what it is and tell you what the language is. That'd be better still, because you could keep it even more blinded, right? But somehow this never seems to happen. I suppose it could be the case that these phenomena are real, right? Like, there is real demon possession who speak languages that the person didn't know. And it's just that the priests or the exorcists or the doctors like Dr. Gallagher, they're just so bad at critical thinking and scientific reasoning that they never think to do any of these things. They never think to record anything, take records, take recordings, bring in external experts who have like no contact with the case. They just somehow never think to do any of this stuff and publish it and have those records available. It's just, darn it, if only we'd thought to do this. Oh well, you just have to take my word for it. It's embarrassing. It's just absolutely embarrassing. And this is his job. He's been doing this for decades apparently, and somehow it's just, you know what, we never thought to do it or something. Yeah, it's never had a tape recorder handy, I suppose. Never thought to bring one. Oh well.
Spirits are fallen angels. They are much smarter than we are, sad to say.
Well, maybe they're much smarter than
Einstein. I mean, they're angels, and they're pure spirits who can have some effect on the material world. They've been observing human beings since the beginning of history, because they pre-exist human beings. And I've heard many different languages spoken. I was at an exorcism once where the person was speaking what sounded like a vaguely Slavic language, and there were about 8 of us observers, and we didn't know what language was being spoken. And at the end of the exorcism that day, the priest was asked, "Did you know what language was being spoken?" And he said, "Yes, the woman was speaking perfect Bulgarian, because I was born in Bulgaria," which we hadn't known. Now, there's no way this woman had lived in America her whole life. She had no connection with Bulgaria. Again, this woman I talked about, who
see, that's interesting, right? So, I mean, I don't. How well does he know the woman that he's talking about? Like how does she know? Sorry, how does he know that she had no connection with Bulgaria? Assuming that the priest could be believed, but it's just we never get enough detail to make any assessment about this. And why is the demon speaking Bulgarian? Like, how is that a better explanation than, well, maybe she picked up some Bulgarian and she didn't even know where it came from? Or, yeah, well, there's also whether we can believe the priest, but it's just like, why does, the demon knows Bulgarian and decided to speak it for some reason? Of course, we're not told what they were. It'd be more impressive if we knew what was being said. All we ever get is, it was this language. Like, this is all I've ever heard. It was this language. It's never, they were saying this in the language. Why don't we ever hear what they were saying? It's just, they spoke the language. It's always so vague that you wonder, like, well, what was the substance here? And anyway, why would the demon do that? Like, how is that a good explanation? This just seems to be completely random, like everything else that you throw at this.
I also came to know very well, who through the deacon across the room, she spoke perfect Latin during the exorcism. Now she had, she wasn't brought up Catholic or anything. She was not very educated. All of a sudden, speaking perfect Latin, it just makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the sort of question to ask. Like, so the priest knows Bulgarian, but it's impossible for the lady to have known Bulgarian. Like, really? Like, I mean, how well do you know the lady? Like, do you know everything about her background? And like, well, how did the priest know it then? Maybe the priest was demon possessed as well. You just need so much more information to even make sense of how all these pieces are supposed to fit together. And we're just never given that. So all we can do is speculate as to what actually happened. I'm skeptical about the whole story, to be honest. I mean, did the priest even exist? Who knows, right? But it's just weird that he never feels the need to provide these details, or never seems to think that they're necessary. And I think that there's interesting implications here for things like the Gospels, right? It's to like, I mean, obviously we're in a different context. We're in a literate context, in a post-enlightenment and all these other things, and we have different expectations about reports and things. But apparently, some people haven't really, seen the memo and all those sorts of things. They're just happy to accept these extremely vague stories with no source. And very little detail, and no way to validate them about, oh yeah, some woman started speaking Bulgarian and there's no way she could have known Bulgarian. And then the priest is like, oh, that's Bulgarian. Wow, must be demons. That is actually compelling to some people, including Dr. Gallagher, apparently. From what he wasn't actually there himself. Oh no, was he saying? No, that's right. He was there himself, but he doesn't actually know Bulgarian. He's entirely relying on that priest, right? And he's reporting that to us. So, but the point is that then other people hear that like, oh, that's amazing evidence. And again, I'll show you in a moment, once we get through the interview, of what I'm talking about. It's just really credulous people who just believe these sorts of things. And so I can completely understand how, especially in the time of ancient Palestine, how people would have just believed stories that people told about Jesus, if they, wanted to believe them effectively. Because people just believe these stories today that are just equally as absurd and lacking in detail. Anyway, but that's a bit of a tangent. But it's so hard to understand why apologists will claim, oh, no people would have believed this without, good solid evidence and lots of eyewitnesses and detailed reports and things like when, bro, have you seen what people believe today? Like even in cases like this that are, directly analogous in terms of like demon possession, it's just people believe anything with no evidence at all.
I remember talking to a woman who reported to me that her husband, who was possessed, he was a criminal. He was like a drug lord.
Do you like the start of this? He remembers talking to a woman whose husband was a criminal. Oh, okay, so he remembers talking to a woman. What are we supposed to do with that? There's absolutely no way to validate anything that's being said here, or even establish whether he even is talking about a real woman, or misremembering something, conflating details, or just making it up, right? Like, this is what I mean. Oh, I remember talking to a woman whose husband was a criminal. Oh, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. Like, this is an idle, this is idle gossip that you just sort of talk about. Oh, sure, grandpa, whatever. Like, it's so vague that it's utterly meaningless to even try to come up with explanations for this, because like there's no facts here, right? That there's just fluff. It's like, oh, I spoke to a woman. Well, let's see what he says about.
And he had turned to very evil stuff, which is why he became possessed.
He turned to evil stuff. Okay, yeah, evil stuff. It was evil.
Not only did he levitate in their apartment, and she observed it. She said, I myself had gone to Catholic schools, meaning the wife, And she said, I knew a little bit of Latin, and I knew that he was speaking Latin. And another woman who during the exorcism.
Okay, so the wife spoke some Latin. Her evil husband spoke a bit of Latin. Maybe the husband also went to Catholic schools or knew someone who went to Catholic schools. Maybe she had spoken Latin to him in the past, little phrases here and there, and he remembered them. Maybe he just, I don't know, looked them up somewhere. Let's see, can we come up with any explanations? Again, why even bother? This story is so vague. But, we'll indulge him. Can we come up with ways that this hypothetical husband might have known a bit of Latin that convinced the wife that he was speaking Latin? Well, maybe he learned it in the same way that she did. Or he heard it from someone else, or he read it somewhere, or she told it to him. Wow, that was easy. Okay. No, it must be demons that enjoy speaking Latin while levitating for some reason. Okay, yeah, that's a good explanation.
Now, admittedly, she was speaking in English, but she was commenting on the Latin prayers, and she was mocking the Latin prayers. So when the priest was saying in Latin, I know Latin because I was a classics major at Princeton. When she said,
so I think that he was just saying that, right? So he actually does speak Latin, apparently. That's interesting.
When the priest was reciting,
of course, having studied it doesn't mean that you actually remember it and can speak it well, but that's another issue.
He rose. He resurrection in tertia dei. He rose from the dead on the third day. The demon said in English, even though this woman had no knowledge of Latin. No, he didn't. He didn't rise from the dead. So, yeah, I've seen plenty of evidence myself. Now, again, Cameron, people have all kinds of theories. Well, maybe unconsciously she had heard this language.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you have to use your judgment.
Wow, that's so implausible that someone could have heard something and then forgotten about it or not remembered where they heard it from. Oh, that's pretty implausible. You're right, Dr. Gallagher. It's got to be demons. That's way more plausible than someone forgot where they heard something, because that never happens. But demons, that happens all the time.
All of a sudden, this woman who never went to Bulgaria, never had any contact with a Bulgarian.
Allegedly.
I've also heard Asian languages spoken that people later say to me, yeah, that was Chinese.
Asian languages.
These people have no experience with this language, but the demon is showing off by speaking the language. And people...
He spoke Latin like Cartman spoke fluent swearing in South Park movie. Well, actually, it reminds me, there's another episode of South Park where, what is it? They give the award to the Germans for having the worst sense of humor, and then they show these German politicians and other leaders come and accept the award, and they have them speaking like German, but it's just read out by American actors who have, I think it's just regular voice actors who have no knowledge of German, so it's just like the worst pronounced German ever. And just completely mangled. It just reminds me of that. It's like, oh man, they're speaking German. It's amazing. Anyway.
People say, well, I'd want to see, and there are tapes of this stuff too. People say, well, I want to see more evidence. Some people you just can't convince of anything, and you have to recognize that some people are not going to be convinced, even if they saw a miracle right in front of them. Jesus Christ said, even though the Son of Man will rise from the dead, there will be people who do not believe, and that's exactly.
So, Dr. Gallagher, my requirement is the same standard of evidence that you use, or I hope that you use in your own medical practice, in terms of the types of evidence that we require to believe a claim. It's something that's repeatable, within reason, that can be documented objectively, that we can fit into a general scientific framework, that we can publish and discuss and develop an understanding of the scientific method, broadly speaking. That's all I'm asking for. I'm not asking for anything beyond that. I'm holding you to the same standard that you should, and I presume that you would hold himself to, in the context of his medical work or his psychiatric work. I don't think that's an unreasonable standard. I think that's that's quite reasonable for me to ask that. And they can't even come close. He doesn't even try to meet that standard. Let's be honest. It hasn't even tried. Did he make a vague reference to there are tapes or something or something like recordings or something? That would be interesting. Of course, there's issues about that, but that would be more convincing than I spoke to a woman once, at the very least. But all we got was some vague reference to it and, not actual presentation of the tapes or discussion of them. Anyway, yes, we're all being hyper skeptical by just postulating that someone can misremember something, or people can make things up for attention or delude themselves of something to get attention. Yeah, those are just really implausible explanations. We're just hyper skeptical here.
What happened? When St. Paul went to Corinth, which is a little bit like somebody going from Kansas to, I don't know, San Francisco or something. He said, I know this man rose from the dead. he did appear to me separately, but after rising from the dead, he appeared to 500 people. This is the letter to the Corinthians. And he said, so you don't have to believe me. Don't believe me. Just interview one of these other 500 people. I often make the analogy every couple of years. In fact,
Yeah, I guess I mean, this is the same argument that's typically made. Dr. Gallagher, do you remember who Paul was talking to? He was talking to the Corinthians. Now, do you know where Corinth is? And do you know where Jerusalem is? Do you know how easy it was in the first century for someone to go from Corinth, particularly an everyday person, to go from Corinth to Jerusalem? You could do it, of course. It was, possible. People did it, right? But it's not something you did at the drop of a hat. Oh, and by the way, they spoke Greek in Corinth, as most people did. In Jerusalem, well, some people spoke Greek, the educated people, but the ordinary people spoke Aramaic. So you might need a translator as well. Meanwhile, people just believe all sorts of nonsense that they just hear on the internet. So we know that people will believe things without sufficient evidence, as if people in the ancient world would have bothered to go to all of that expense and effort to actually interview one of these people. Have these people never looked at a map? Did they never think about this? It's like, oh, I'll just go to Corinth and just interview someone who speaks a different language about this event that happened years ago. And oh, by the way, I don't have the names of any of these people, so I have to track them down first. Who knows how many of them are still alive and how many of them are still there, and how I could verify that any of them were actually telling the truth. The whole thing is utterly absurd, especially when you compare it to the fact that there are so many claims that people believe that you can falsify it with a 3-second Google search and people just don't do it. Whatever. If believing this sort of nonsense gets you through your day, then I don't know.
This summer, I'm going to address the International Association of Exorcists, which is about 500 exorcists. I said, you can read my book, and a lot of people have told me it's very persuasive, but you don't have to believe Dr. Gallagher. I mean, talk to any of these other 500 exorcists. They've written books too. People ignore their books. Oh, they're priests, I mean, I suppose because I'm a professor of psychiatry, I've had a little more success, by the grace of God, convincing people. But I say, you don't have to believe me. Like St. Paul said about witnesses to the resurrection, interview one of these 500 other people. Now, again, you have to put it in perspective, right? I mean, there were people after Jesus rose from the dead, St. Paul claimed 500 people, who witnessed it. God, in my opinion, was giving people a pretty clear message. What Jesus Christ himself said is not going to convince everybody. So there is a matter of judgment in how much you believe. I have a good friend. He happens to be Jewish. And it's not like over the years, Cameron, I would go around talking to everybody about what I did. I had no hesitation about telling people, but even a close friend, when the book came out, he said, Rich, I read your book. Why didn't you tell me you had this tremendous experience with possessions? And I said, well, Cliff is his name. He's a physician himself. I knew him during my internship year. And I said, well, Cliff, I don't go around talking to everybody about it, And I said, what do you think of the book?
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if it's because he feels embarrassed about it in certain contexts. I don't know. Maybe he's not self-aware enough to feel embarrassed, but I would feel embarrassed given what we've just heard for the past hour.
This is a good man. He's not particularly religious. He wasn't brought up as a religious Jew. I think he has some vague belief in God. And he said to me, Rich, I'll tell you what I think. This is a fairly intelligent guy. He said, I don't think anybody can read your book and say that there's a very good case that there is strong evidence for evil spirits. But Cameron, it's not going to convince everybody. I'll tell you what I think. This is a fairly intelligent guy. He said, I don't think anybody can read your book and say that there's a very good case that there is strong evidence for evil spirits.
Yeah, I think he misspoke there. Am I just mishearing this? He said, so Gallagher said that the Jewish guy said that the Jewish guy doesn't think that someone can read Gallagher's book and think that there is a strong case for demon possession, right? Like that seems to be the opposite of what he wants to say.
I don't think anybody can read your book and say that there's a very good case that there is strong evidence for evil spirits.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can read your book and say that there is strong evidence for evil spirits. So, yeah, I think the Jewish guy might have been onto something there if that is in fact what he said. Oh dear.
But Cameron, it's not going to convince everybody. And I know that. I don't try to convince everybody. I try to convince people who are open to it, because my own view, like Pascal, is that God gives us evidence, sometimes plenty of evidence. I was talking to a biblical scholar the other day we've sort of become friendly. He's a Protestant professor in Kentucky. His name is Craig Keener. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a very prolific scholar, and he's written several books, probably the best modern books, endorsed even by the Catholic Bishop Barron, about miracles. And the evidence is overwhelming. But of course, it doesn't convince everybody. Most people just sort of ignore that sort of thing. I myself was on the Medical Bureau of Lords And any doctor in the world can go to the archives. I used to live in France. I played a little semi-pro basketball, and I was a teacher in a French high school, and I could get down to Lourdes a few times, and I went through the archives. I mean, there's many very credible miracles, even much more than have been sort of publicized as unequivocal. So,
trust me, bro. I looked at the archives. Wow, that convinces me.
yeah, but you have to be open to that. You have to be open to looking at things like miracles or possessions, because if you want to ignore it, God allows you to ignore it. God doesn't force himself on people.
All right, I'm kind of had enough of this. I think there's a few minutes before we get to the Q&A, but it's getting late and I'm kind of sick of listening to this guy. But I did want to show you, and I did promise that I would show you people who do take this seriously, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to look at this video, because where's the... Oh, yeah, here it is. I was trying to find the view count. 58,000 views. I'll show you a comparison to some of his other videos in a moment. Needless to say, this is... quite a lot of views for Cameron's channel. Let's see what we have to say in the comments here. So, my father was a pastor of a conservative Reformed church. Oh, okay, yeah, Reformed in this context. I was thinking in the Jewish context, and like those are different things, but no. In the Christian context, there can be this. So confusing. Anyway, so my father had several experiences with possession over a period of 50 years. He said that the most gratifying aspect of this ministry was to observe how manifesting demons couldn't stand the name of Jesus when he was invoked. It's like a password. It's like magical. I don't know. The vibrations of the air somehow cause an immaterial spirit harm. Yeah, that doesn't really make sense, but whatever. Gallagher is extremely credible. This episode is mind-blowing. Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. Thank you, Jesus. Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. I think that means greater is Jesus than Satan, right? But isn't... Yeah, okay. Scientia. If anyone is wondering why Dr. Gallagher doesn't explain the medical evaluation but simply appeals to his own experiences, because he knows that if he were to try to explain Cameron and most of his listeners would have no clue what he's saying, it's almost impossible to translate medical explanation to layman's terms. Medical education is literally learning a foreign what? Don't know what happened there. I don't actually know if this person is speaking in favor or against Dr. Gallagher here, because it's not really clear. Desire in patients doesn't provide the years of specialized education necessary to understand what goes into medical evaluations. Yeah, I actually can't tell what the guy's point is. The thing is that you can actually articulate complex scientific ideas in comprehensible language, especially when you have an hour to do it in. You just have to kind of like try. You have to like make the bare minimum of effort, which he didn't attempt to do in the slightest. So I don't really buy that. Thank you for this incredible teaching. In regards to demonic activity with technology, I had spirit box recordings of demons. I don't know what a spirit box is. Maybe someone can inform me in chat. Saying things to me that nobody else knew. Nobody else knew. Yeah, what is a spirit box recording? I don't think the hell is a spirit box recording? I don't think I can make sense of that without understanding what this is. Oh, some ghost hunter? Electronic voice phenomena. But like, couldn't you just have recorded that yourself? Yeah, okay. I was deep in the occult and satanic worship during this time. When I became a Christian and repented, I deleted all of the tapes. Interesting. Why is there an ellipsis here? I've dealt with evil... Oh, yeah, I saw this one before. I've dealt with evil, vile humans that do horrendous, cruel things. Not necessarily criminal, but their motives are pure filth and are diabolical, vindictive, and destructive, as well as lacking empathy in a depraved manner. Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. No one person can tell me that there are no demons. People are inhabited by demons, and there are way more demons and more of the possessed than ever before. 35 likes. I mean, what do you do with people like this, right? Unless this is a troll, but if it's a troll, it's not a very amusing one, and I suspect that it's not. Deleted the tape says, my girlfriend lives in Canada vibes. Yeah, that's a good one. But this is really interesting, right? Because isn't it part of Christian theology that, original sin and that people are kind of depraved and corrupted because of the influence of, that sin that's passed down from Adam and so forth. So why do we need to invoke demon possession to explain the fact that people do horrendous, cruel things? It doesn't even seem to make sense under their own theology. And how do you just jump to people are inhabited by demons? Why does that follow? there are way more demons and more of the possessed than ever before. How could there be more demons than ever before? I mean, is God creating demons? Is he like pumping out more of them? It's like, oh, we're running low on on people available or demons available for possession. Got to like, how does that even work? Like, is God still creating demons, or is it like a one-off thing? Is it like a limited edition? Buy it now, or you'll regret it later if you don't pick one up, or is it like there's a production line and they just keep incrementing the serial number? Like, how does that work exactly? So maybe there are more demons now. I don't know. Maybe he needs to keep pace with population growth. Interesting questions that somehow you never hear discussed. Ask the question of language. My aunt Annette was born in Paris. She was working for the French embassy in West Africa. Oh, that's cool. Because she spoke multiple languages, the local bishop asked her to examine a person for evidence of demon possession. She was taken to a remote village way out in the bush. She walked into the mud hut and the man looked at her, and before she had been introduced, spoke to her. Am I missing something here? Like, it feels like that's not all of the comment, but what am I missing something here? That what's amazing about this? Am I supposed to click on something?
And have been.
That's not what I wanted.
Typical of an oppression. And
what? I don't understand what. Oh, okay. Well, that wasn't there before. I don't know. Maybe I'm just turning into a boomer. Spoke to her in perfect Parisian French, not just French, Parisian French. She could not get out of there fast enough. Okay, I don't quite understand why it's impossible. So this is the same. This is the same reasoning, right? So there was a woman in this village in West Africa somewhere who spoke Parisian French. That's fine, apparently. But the fact that there was allegedly another person who spoke Parisian French in this same village is impossible to explain. Can someone explain to me why one of them requires a demon explanation, but the other doesn't? I mean, I don't know who this other person was or how they might have gotten there, but she got there. So why couldn't they have gotten there despite speaking Parisian French? That's, of course, assuming that any of this is true. Yeah, just bizarre. This is the point, that people just accept this. 58 likes, and people just sort of accept this as being evidence of anything. Thanks for having that. Oh, no, that's something else he talked about. I don't have an issue with that. I was an edgy atheist for 8 years and had a brutal case of demon possession. Brutal case? I wonder what a brutal case like. Demon possession 2016. I'm back in church now praying 5 hours a day. This stuff is real. 5 hours a day? Man, that must be tiring. You look at the guys Cameron has had on Talk About Demons. Yeah, there's quite a lot of them now. Dr. Gallagher, Father Martins, Father Vincent Lampert, and others. These are not dumb or crazy guys. Dr. Gallagher went to Princeton and was a psychiatrist for probably 40 or 50 years. Father Martins was a very smart guy as well. You should probably be skeptical, but not so skeptical that you won't listen to what these guys have to say and realize there may be things that go on in this world that many of us aren't privy to. So the thing is that was actually my point, right? I completely think I agree that there are things that go on in this world that we aren't privy to or that we don't know about. I'm not the one who actually is claiming to know everything in the sense of what's going on in all of these cases. It's these guys who are claiming to know. They reckon they're demons, right? I reckon that, well, I can offer some postulates, but I don't know. And I suspect that there are many aspects of psychology in particular that we don't understand very well. So it's weird how somehow the skeptic is being closed-minded when it's the theist or the believer in demon possession who's actually offering the answer. And when you're like, I'm not sure about that, they're like, no, it's demons. You're being closed-minded. It's demons. Somehow we're the ones being closed-minded, when then there are people who are saying things like, no one can tell me that there are no demons. Or remember Dr. Gallagher earlier on in the video, he said he was 100% confident in his assessment of a particular patient. And yet we're the ones who are closed-minded. I don't see how that fits. Dr. Gallagher comes across as both open, honest, and authoritative. Yeah, well, as long as you don't pay attention to what he says, I actually think he comes across as really slimy and kind of self-aggrandizing, actually, in a bit of a subtle way. But anyway, your interview technique has come along nicely too. Well, I'll comment on that. One of my friends started to work as a psychic, but he gave up. He couldn't see any future in it. Ha, 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 ha. You got me there. It is frustrating that my significant other, atheist engineer, what, do they mean godless engineer? Like the YouTuber? Still does not believe in demons' possessions despite medical evidence. Can't change him. Thank God I am aware. Like that really feels like it's a troll. That's such a bizarre thing to say. Still does not believe in demons' possessions. Why would you believe in demons' possessions? I mean, of all the things to believe, why would it be demons' possessions? This is so eye-opening. Thank you for having this podcast. Can you lead me to where you can learn more about how to remove demon influence or oppression near us? Yes, convert to atheism. That's a pretty or deconvert, I suppose. That's a pretty foolproof, maybe not 100%, but it's a pretty reliable method of getting rid of demon possession and oppression. I found myself searching, are demons real into YouTube? I'm sure that's going to be a useful search term. I was a Christian. I'd say I'm now very skeptical agnostic that would quite like for Christianity to be true. I found it a weird coincidence that you posted that debate mere hours before I searched it. Oh, must be demons. It's coincidence here. And then this shows up in my Rex, the exact thing I searched as the thumbnail graphic. Weird stuff, lol. Yeah, must be demons. Anyway, I think I'm belaboring the point a bit here, but you see that there are definitely people who are eating this up. And who just appear to just accept this uncritically. Now, let me just finish by showing why Cameron does this. It's not hard to figure it out, right? It's pretty transparent. So this is his live video section, which is, I think, most of his content. Let's actually just look for some of the more recent videos. This was 10 hours ago, so let's put that one to the side. This one's 10 days ago, so it's got a bit of time. Cameron has 175,000 subscribers, which is quite a lot. But you see that his video views are usually much, much less than that. 3.4K, 6.4K, 4K. This one's more, 45K. That was about a revival, so it's a bit different to his normal content. 12K, 17K. This is a debate. Those typically do better. This is a demon one. 5.6K, another demon one. 5.7K. So like most of his videos get like 5K views, which is really poor. I'm trying to think of the word, really poor uptake in terms of the number of subscribers he has. But let's look at the popular videos. Okay, 1.2 million, demons. Next one down, 446,000, that's a debate. 260,000, demons. 200K, that's Catholicism. 130K, Catholicism. 120K, Catholicism and exorcism. We get a 2-for-1 there. This is a kind of a debate thing. So that's 120K. Then we've got 120K, another demon. This one kind of is a standout because it's not Catholic or demon or debate. It's just Gary Habermas. So I don't know why that one's got a lot. This is about the Ravi Zacharias scandal. So you can kind of see why that would get so many views. And then we're below 100,000 at this point. So, debate. This was another demon exorcism one, 63K views. Debate. Another demons one. That's, I can't even keep track. That's not the one that we looked at. The one that we just looked at was, or is it the one we just looked at? I don't even know. I can't keep track at this point which one we just did. But anyways, where were we? Lost track of it. No, that was the one we just did. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Yeah, so that's Galligan. Yeah, so that's demons. Debate. I think those are the demon ones, or is there another one down here somewhere? You can see that some of the most popular ones. So this is 4 months ago. That's a demon one. These are a bit older. These are like 2 years ago. This is a demon one. This is a month ago. And then the one we just looked at, that's 2 years ago. So that's a bit of an older one, but the one we just looked at a month ago. Anyway, the point I'm making here is that it's very clear that Cameron has a lot of subscribers, but very few of them watch his videos. We're talking like less than 5% watch his videos, most of his videos. The exceptions are debates that do better, and demon videos, and maybe I'll lump Catholic content in there as well because there's often overlap there. Those do really well. And it's pretty obvious that he's cashing in on the demon content lately. Now, let's have a look at Cameron's channel. What's the purpose of the channel? Exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. If you were to talk to, I don't know, any educated, intelligent Christian and ask them, let's suppose you were to develop content exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief, how much of your time would you spend talking about demons? I imagine many of them would probably say none. Others might say, a tiny, tiny sliver. Of all of the things to cover, that's like, tiny, tiny little bit here. Think about all the things in theology and, biblical scholarship and apologetics that you could cover. How much are you going to spend talking about demons? Little, if any, I think would be any reasonable answer. And certainly that's consistent with the books that I have, big fat apologetics books and theology books, and they say almost nothing about demons. But somehow it's a major part of Cameron's channel, especially recently. As you saw, there was like half a dozen videos in the top 20 or so that were about demon possession, and many of them in the last few months. So there's two possible explanations for this. One is that Cameron himself has become possessed by a demon who is sort of subconsciously trying to out themselves and is posting up all this demon content. I don't think that's a very good explanation, but we should stay open-minded to this. A second possibility is that Cameron is just going after money here. He just wants views and doesn't really care how to get them. And he's seen that demon videos do well. And so he's putting up more demon videos. I'll leave it to you, the intelligent audience, as to which of those you think is more intellectually credible. All right, I think that's all I wanted to say this evening. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Let me just have a quick look if there's any last comments. I'm to blame. I find these demon videos really funny. Yeah, I mean, they are kind of funny. Oops. But one of the reasons I wanted to cover these is because like so many people take these seriously just from the views and the comments on them, right? So most of the stuff Cameron is doing, people don't seem to care about. They don't seem to care about the cosmological argument or the ontological argument or the fine-tuning argument, but they care about demons apparently. As well as some debates with atheists. So maybe that's the other thing to look into. But anyway, so it is disconcerting. And I think it is worth spending a bit of time to show just how ridiculous this is and how honestly little effort it takes to expose the nonsense that Cameron is peddling here. I seriously doubt that Cameron believes much of this stuff himself. But of course, getting him to admit to that publicly would be difficult. But I just think it's so transparent that he's doing this for the views. Like there's just no other credible explanation as to why you would do this. And that reflects very poorly on Cameron's character and motivations from my point of view, especially given the context of, his other instances, like a major funder dies and immediately afterwards you post not something to support his family, but something encouraging people to support you because you've lost a major funder. Like he's done things like this in the past, right? So it's not really out of character for him. And so it's kind of disappointing because it would be nice to have a better apologetics, counter apologetics kind of dynamic on YouTube. But unfortunately, just a lot of it is this sort of view-seeking content that's just extremely cringe. Not that atheists never do that as well, by the way, but I think that they at least don't do it about demon possession. And then there's the whole side about the fact that this is feeding in and taking advantage of vulnerable people, which I think we pretty clearly see that Dr. Gallagher engages in that himself, not taking responsibility for them as patients, not having any accountability or anything like this. Despite the fact that he's offering at least some of them medical advice and even diagnosing them. So there's that side of it as well. So I think that there's a whole host of harms that are being committed here, consciously or unconsciously. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this. Milking metaphysics, upcoming rebranding. Yeah, I mean, at least that'd be a bit more honest, I think. Exorcists seem to be motivated by the attention and prestige they get from peddling this pet food. Yeah, I think that that's probably true. And I think that Dr. Gallagher, again, he's not an exorcist himself, but he's sort of exorcist adjacent, I suppose you could say. He gives them intellectual cover. He even actually said that himself. He said the fact that he is a doctor gives him a bit more credibility than other people have had. But yeah, he sort of said himself that he's not averse to the idea of, he was like interested in this idea of the movie deal or whatever it was that he had some involvement in or whatever of one of his cases. And obviously he's promoting his book by going on Cameron's channel. That was very clear. So, it's pretty clear that he likes the attention that this brings him, which is in itself not necessarily a problem. It's not wrong to like attention for things, but the question is how that motivation fits in with other things, right? And in the context, it's, I think, pretty dodgy. Especially then when you have the gall to then say, oh, well, I'm not trying to convince people. I'm just bringing the truth and not everyone will listen just as they didn't listen to Jesus. I mean, come on, get off your high horse. Like you like attention just as much as anyone else does, clearly. Let's have an open conversation about this and actually, you can present some actual evidence and, see how far we get. Anyway, it's clear that that's not really what the real motivation behind a lot of this is. I think it's very clear. All right. So maybe I'll just quickly mention what's coming up on the channel. So I still have to finish my my reading and commentary on my book. I've done the first 3 sections, which comprise chapter 1. Next one will be on the fine-tuning argument. So hopefully I'll get that out, I don't know, in the next few months when I get some time to do that. Obviously, I'm still working on my thesis and I have a science podcast as well. So among other things that I'm involved in. So there's quite a lot of demands on my time. So I'm sorry I'm not being quite as active on the channel recently. In terms of bad apologetics, I'm not quite sure when the next episode will be coming out. There are a few topics that I would like to cover with Nathan. I'm not quite sure. I know he moved cities relatively recently and started a new job fairly recently. So I'm not quite sure what his schedule is looking like. So hopefully we'll be able to do some more of that in the not too distant future. Yeah, I'm just trying to think. The other thing is that I'm continuing to work on my naturalism book, which still probably a few years away from actually being published. But hopefully, when I get some time, I'll be able to bring some of that content onto the channel. So, yeah, stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more of these sort of impromptu reviews of videos that I think are important. And by the way, if people have particular thing like videos or articles or whatever that they think would be useful to cover, yeah, feel free to send them my way or message them to me or email me or something like that. You know, there's way more apologetics content than I can cover. A lot of it's highly repetitive, and I kind of get bored at just covering the exact same argument over again, although I will do it if it's prominent enough or it's receiving a lot of attention or it's a different way of presenting it or something. So anyway, I try to balance that out in terms of what I think is worth covering. But if you have suggestions, please send them my way. Yeah, so this issue about the psychophysical harmony argument, yes, that's one that I want to discuss on with Nathan on his channel at About Apologetics. So that, yeah, we will get to that at some point, but it's want to do properly. All right, I think I will head off now. Thanks everyone for keeping me company on this rather ridiculous video. Hopefully you found it interesting. Take care. Talk to you next time. See ya.